Morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out and taking time away from your summer. I know this isn't something that you're being compensated for by your school, so it's really remarkable that so many people have shown up and you have shown your commitment to teaching about Holocaust and genocide studies. We at Stockton take the state mandate very seriously and have really been pushing for more and more education across the schools in Holocaust and genocide studies. And I think a year or so ago we were told by Yad Vashem that we teach more classes and more students than any other institution in the world, it would be hard to replicate what we do. We have somewhere in the realm of 15 courses a semester, 1,000 students a year, and that's before you start factoring in, we have a master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies that Raz Siegel will tell us about in a minute. We have a new genocide prevention certificate that we just recently brought in 10 students from Iraq who are registering to teach about genocide prevention in Kurdistan. We have also, and you're about to hear about this from Steve Marcus, we also have dual credit in the high school. So in addition to the 1,000 students we teach at Stockton, not all of these students are getting credit, but with the 20 classes that we have around this area, we're probably adding another 500 students who are learning about Holocaust and genocide studies. And they can take that credit here, they can take that credits to some other institution. And what we hope for them is that even if they don't come here, and we do see it as a really nice recruiting tool as well, but even if they don't come here, they will go to their institute, their new school, and they'll say, why don't you have a class in Holocaust and genocide study? And that way we put pressure on other institutions to spread the word about the need for this very important education. So we hope that this is the beginning. Some of you are here probably for the first time. Many I see very many familiar faces as well. But we hope this is the beginning of a long relationship that maybe some of you will want to explore a master's degree. But maybe you'll just want to use the great resources that Gail is going to provide, and Mary and everyone else here who's putting on this wonderful workshop. So please take advantage of this, and please take it back to your schools and put pressure on your administrations to keep spreading these classes, because they are they're vitally important in this day and age. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Rob. If you follow your white sheet, you'll know who are the lineup of people that will be speaking. And let me just underline quickly what Rob just said, Dean Gregg just said. I was just like you for many years. I taught in the public schools. And this is a wow, 60 of you signed up for our workshop. I thank you. During your summer vacation, during your time you're not getting compensated, you've come to expand your knowledge about the Holocaust and other genocides. And I thank you. We deeply appreciate it. I was asked to talk a little bit, and you'll see it, introduction to the story of Wally and Lutz Hammerschlag. At lunchtime, you will be meeting Leonard Hammerschlag, the son of Wally and Lutz. And Leonard came to us about a year or so ago, and he said, I want to tell you my parents' story. It's unique. It's unique for our family. It's a story of survival and resilience. But it's also a story that's not that unique. My parents did not know each other in 1938, but they were both impacted by the November pogrom, by Kristallnacht. My mother was in Frankfurt am Main, and she wrote an essay that you're going to receive at lunchtime that appeared in a journal in Israel, where they eventually ended up after they went to Rhodesia, where she and her family went to Rhodesia. And then there's her father, who grew up in a small village in Germany, a place that many of us had never heard of, called Lauenau. And in Lauenau, they didn't even know Kristallnacht had happened. And Jews came there thinking this is a paradise, this is an island. Of course, we know that wasn't true. And someone told his father, you know, get a trade, forget about going to the university. Maybe this will help you. And so the father became an auto mechanic, and through various means, he and his family were able to escape to Rhodesia. And when he arrived in Rhodesia, he set up an auto mechanic place, which also offered driving lessons. And Wally came for driving lessons, and that's how they met. And so began the family of Mr. and Mrs. Hammerschlag, Wally and Lutz. I'm making a long story very short. We've made an exhibit, which is in Ventnor, New Jersey. It's free, it's open to the public. If any of you want to bring your students to it, to learn the story about Kristallnacht and how it impacted two different families and the journeys that they took, that they ended up in Rhodesia, which is not a common story, and then they went on to Israel and then eventually came here to the United States. So I'd like to, and I am the director, as it says, of the Holocaust Resource Center, the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center, and I encourage you, please, anything we can do to assist you and help you, we're here for you. Raz Siegel is going to come forward now representing our master's program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. No, Raz, they need this for recording, that's why. Thank you.
Let's walk around. What? I can take that out? Okay. So hi, I'm Raz. Good morning. Thank you for coming today. I won't take too much of your time, just a few minutes, and I'll be here during lunch. And then if there's any questions or specific comments or anything else you want to know about the MOG program, the Master in Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, then I'll be more than happy to answer questions. And I can also, maybe, I don't know if the... Everybody has this, but also, I'm also happy to leave you my phone, emails, if you want to have any, if you want to send me any questions or anything like that, that's also perfectly fine. Just a few words. We have, I think, the most established master's program in the US. We have 5 full faculty positions teaching courses in the master's program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Actually, I came to teach, this will be the beginning of my second year at Stockton, beginning in September. And I came to teach specifically because I wanted to teach here at Stockton. That's why I applied to Stockton, that's why I came, because of the master's program, because of what Stockton is doing in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We have people teaching really on so many aspects of the Holocaust and on so many other cases of genocide and mass violence. But most importantly, we have a lot of courses and a lot of sections and courses that deal with the Holocaust in the broader frame of genocide and mass violence, that open up new questions and new perspectives to think about, that sometimes leave the students, and I see here at least one student, Liz Clam, who participated in 2 of my seminars last year, so she'll confirm this, that some cases our courses leave more answers than questions. They leave people confused. Actually, I always joke and I say that my goal is to leave students confused, right? To make sure that we're all very much perplexed at the end of a seminar, right? To have us thinking about things without any clear answers, without any comforting conclusions. I mean, this is the goal of education after all, right? This is why we're all here today, and this is why we do what we do. So this is what we do here at Stockton, and about this very important topic of the Holocaust, of genocide, of mass violence. This is really, I think, the most invigorating master's program. It'll give you a lot to take back to your classes. It will give through this a lot to your students to think about, right? And I really highly recommend that you think about it, if it's possible for you, if it's something that you're considering. And as I said, I'll be happy to answer any other questions. You can send me emails, and I look forward to talking with you and to engaging with you today. Have a good seminar. Anyone who graduated or is learning in the master's program, could you please stand? Liz? Oh, yes, I forgot. Thank you, Rob. Where the master's program now is also available all online, right? So that's a big advantage, I think, probably for many of you. You can take the whole program online now. Also, the genocide prevention certificate that we have is fully online. So that, too. I'm really bad in marketing, but I had some things that I wanted to say. What?
We're not grading it.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So we'll talk later.
I'd like to thank Professor Siegel for the introduction. I'm Steve Marcus, and I am the coordinator of Holocaust and Genocide dual credit programs. We kind of look at Stockton's Holocaust programs as a table, and there are 4 legs of this table. There's the Holocaust Resource Center with Gail Rosenthal. There's the Holocaust and Genocide minor program. We have several people who have graduated from that. There's the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide. And about 4 years ago, they decided, before I came on board, that it would be a really good idea to have a dual credit program. And so we started with 2 schools, Holy Spirit High School and Vineland High School, both, I think, represented here today. I came aboard, and we are slated in the fall to have a dozen schools, ranging from Lower Cape May to Barnegat over to Sterling High School. And what occurs here is, if you have a Holocaust and Genocide course, we come in and we evaluate it, and we set it up. Or if you do not have one, we help you design one, and students who are enrolled in high school, generally seniors or juniors and seniors, are presented with the opportunity to gain 4 university credits from Stockton University. Last year, we had about 400 students signed up, and about 250 of them took for dual credit. We are looking to expand, and I know that many of you are not high school teachers, but if you're a middle school teacher in a district that does not have Holocaust and Genocide dual credit, we would be happy, and I will go and speak to anyone at any time, anywhere, because it is the 4th leg of this table. This university is very serious about making Holocaust education available to everybody, everywhere, and also very important to making university credits in the state of New Jersey very affordable. The cost is $400 to those who are not subsidized. If your students are on free or reduced lunch, somebody picks up the tab. I do believe it's Harvey Kesselman, our president here. So if you are interested in this, see me at lunch or see me anytime during the 2 days. I have these great business cards that the dean pays for, and handouts. So, what? You can have them back. So I thank you very much. Come see me. Oh, do I get to introduce? I get to introduce someone who is actually a partner in the dual credit, and someone who is my friend. She's kind of, I mean, I'm short, but she gets lost. So most of you know Dr. Mary Johnson. I'm going to describe her as indescribable. So from Facing History and ourselves and Stockton University, I give you my good friend and colleague, Dr. Mary Johnson.
Hi. Very closely related with the dual credit and some of the programs done here at Stockton is Facing History and Ourselves. Basically, we try to weave the study of human behavior into the study of history, all right? And some of you, I think some of you know about Facing History. Any hands go up if you know a little about Facing History? Great. And some of you, I hope we all sort of learn a little about it because it's part of the study of looking at this history. But questions, that just what Roz was talking about there, we can't answer these questions. That's what makes it so interesting and compelling, I think, to keep studying it. The more you look at it, the less you know, in a way. And, you know, it's just it's obsessive in a way because you just have to know more and more. And it's about us people. So that's what Facing History is about. And I am proud to announce we just came, it's so heavy, but the new resource book for Facing History, which tries to weave in a lot more of audiovisual materials, all of the latest in technology is sort of woven in there. We also have it on the website. But basically, it's doing the same thing that Facing History has always done, and that is to start from the base of who are we, and how do we tick, how do we make decisions, and then let's look at the history and see how people then made decisions. But the biggest question of all for all of us, and when we're here today with Yad Vashem, is really thinking about, now we know all about this, we've seen what happened, how do we use that? How do we look at things today? How do we assess our world today? To me, that's one of the most interesting parts of history, that it doesn't die in the past, but it keeps going and keeps influencing our lives, right? So I'm going to turn this back over to who's next? Okay, all right, is it Roz? Okay, please. Here is Yad Vashem. Yes. Robert.
Good morning. My name's Rob Rosette, and I'm from Yad Vashem, but in this crowd I have to say I'm a native New Jerseyan. So, although I've been in Israel for 39 years now. I am partnered with my friend Shani, who will speak in a moment. I'm the content guy, she's the pedagogue. That's the difference between the two of us. I'm a historian in addition to directing the library. And I always say I'm new at Yad Vashem. I've only been there for 36 years. So I'm just new, just trying to get to know the place. I'm not going to tell you all kinds of things, but I was asked to show you a book that I just gave as a present to Gail, which you actually got the introduction for. And I could tell you to buy it, but I don't have any copies here. But, wait a minute. This is representative of something that I've worked on for about 2 years, and also the kind of things we produce at Yad Vashem. This is called After So Much Pain and Anguish. It's an anthology of letters that were written by Holocaust survivors immediately after the liberation at the end of the war. And it covers the length and breadth of Europe and many different experiences. There are 84 letters by almost 60 authors. And the thing that's important, why I'm proud of it and like it so much, is that we tried to understand who the people were who were writing the letters and who the people were they were mentioning, and putting context to documents. So these are first-hand documents. Each and every one of them is very powerful. But in addition to trying to put them in a context, which I think is really a lot of what we deal with at Yad Vashem today, talking about people, but talking about people within the context of the things that were happening to them. So I'll be with you the next 2 days. I just said to Shani, of course, I didn't bring my business cards. I left them in the hotel. So I have a few in my wallet. But tomorrow I'll bring the rest of them. And if you want anything from me after the seminar, feel free. And I'd like to introduce my good friend Shani Lurie, who is from our International School of Holocaust Studies.
Hi, good morning. So as my colleague, Dr. Rosette said, I'm from Yad Vashem, from the International School for Holocaust Studies. I've been teaching high school for, let's just say, a very long time. But I started very young. I was about 12 when I started teaching. Just 2 words about Yad Vashem, not only about myself. Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Institute in Jerusalem, Israel. The largest one in Israel, probably in many fields, the largest one in the world. We have, aside from the International School and the library, which Rob heads, we have a resource and research institution, and of course a very large museum and an international school, which I'm part of, that has seminars from all over the world. We have a few graduates, at least one that I can see here, that attended our summer institute last year, 3-week institute, and we have other seminars for teachers. We have Chinese teachers that come once a year, or once every other year. We had teachers from India. We have teachers, of course, from the United States, from all over Europe, and of course, Israeli teachers that come probably, I would say, on a daily basis, aside from students and stuff like that. So whenever you get a chance to come to our museum, we'll welcome you very much to our seminars and any other possibilities we have for you. You'll see in your bags, we brought all kinds of materials that could be useful for you. Another very important thing I think is important to know about Yad Vashem, that we're partners with ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and the USC Shoah Foundation on a program called Echoes and Reflections that we'll be introducing today, which is a program that was developed here, or was developed by Yad Vashem for teachers here in the United States who teach middle and high school Holocaust in different levels and different, from different disciplines.
Thank you. So how did this come about? Because we can't all go to Jerusalem. So I know, Liz, is there anyone else that has studied at Yad Vashem? I have. And so every other summer, we have a summer institute, a seminar. And the idea behind it, and I wanted to make sure that I said this up front, is that, and Steve gave me a nudge earlier today, and he said, don't forget about your meatballs. Now he walked out of the room. What do we mean by meatballs? We all make meatballs. And I have to tell you, I have friends that are Italian, and their meatballs are a lot different than my grandmother's meatballs that had a recipe from Eastern Europe. They were very sweet and very small. But the meatballs all satisfy our family's needs. And why am I saying that? We, for the next 2 days, are going to introduce approaches, strategies, and techniques that Yad Vashem has developed over many, many years. 2 years ago, we did a Facing History in Ourselves workshop where it was developed starting with human behavior. 2 years prior to that, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum did their first workshop off their campus, just like this is the first workshop that I know that Yad Vashem has developed off of their Jerusalem campus, and Washington came to us. So these are all different strategies and techniques. You take back what works for you, what your recipe is. We're not saying this is the way you need to do it. We are just giving you strategies and techniques. And we all know, as classroom teachers, that every year our class changes. Our students change. Randy, who has taught as many years as I have, and we won't mention how many years that is shaking her head. So take back, we're not saying this is the only way to do it. These are strategies and techniques that have been developed at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And I'm hoping that maybe as a result of our workshop today, there'll be some folks who will come up to Shani and to Rob and say, when is your next teacher workshop? And we'll do our best to help you. We can't fully fund you, but we'll do our best to help you to get you there if you want to expand your knowledge. And the teacher workshop is wait, can you tell us, please?
So we have 2 summer institutes. One is a 3-week program, an international summer conference institute that I think you attended, right? 2 weeks? Well, we have a 3-week one. And time flies when you're having fun. That's all I can say. So there's a 3-week one, and we have also a program for teachers who are associated with Echoes and Reflections. In other words, teachers who teach Echoes and Reflections, and you also have the guides in your goodie bags, can apply to an Echoes and Reflections summer institute. It's a 10-day one. It's a shorter one. It's almost fully funded, that one, the Echoes and Reflections, but you have to apply. look on the email on the website, on the ECHO's website, somewhere around February, March, we start putting out notices about the seminar, and then we have teachers applying. We have about 30 who come a year. So that's another option.
Last thing, I saw some of you trying to quickly write down Rob's book. There's an excerpt from the book that's in your packet, so not to worry. And Rob Rosette was very clever. He gave us the front page, the cover of it, so that if you want to order the book, no, he gets no royalties. Plus, I checked it out. You know, there are ways to get it less expensive, and we'll leave it like that. So it's in there. So we're going to ask we've switched it around a little bit. Okay. So we're going to begin with a very short film, and then we're going to get into our icebreaker. Because we decided that we need a starting point. We have some people here who probably could run this workshop without us. And then we have some folks here that this is the first time they're coming. I know that we have some school superintendents here who said, I need guidance. How do I introduce this into my district? Everything that we're going to show you today and share with you, either you have in your bag, which, by the way, if you added up how much the resource materials are, they run between $300 and $400, what we've given to you today. And so if they're not in your bag, they were available on the internet. So I'm going to begin by asking Shani to come and tell us about this short film that is going to be shown.
This film, What is the Holocaust, is part of a program we have that's called Holocaust Education Video Toolbox that's available online. One of the challenges we know that teachers have is not enough time. I mean, any way you look at it, you never have enough time. Even if you're teaching, whether you're teaching social studies or art or whatever, never enough time. And especially when it comes to a field that is not part of your curriculum. You're just introducing it, you just have limited amount of time. And as much as you want to teach, sometimes you can get lost with all the information. So one of the things we developed at Yad Vashem is these very short videos that are anywhere between 10 to 16 minutes, and each one of them introduces either a historical topic or a strategy or a tool to teach in the classroom. So the videos are mainly geared towards teachers. In other words, they're not videos to just play in the classroom. They're videos for you guys to look at and get an idea of what should be the focal point, you know, what questions, you know, are a good idea to ask, what questions might come up, what resources are available. You'll see that in some of the movies there are sections or parts that you can introduce to your students. So we'll be using a few of these videos along the day. You can just access them by going online. I mean, you don't have to register or anything, they're just out there available, and I'll say that every year we develop a few more on different, you know, topics.
I guess I'm sort of in the position of fulfilling the old adage that I wrote you a long letter because I didn't have enough time to write you a short letter. I'm the guy I'm going to try and give you some of the information you need in the background that maybe will help you write that short letter when you only have a little time to teach. But my personal philosophy is the more that you know, the better you're going to be at trying to condense things for those students, and when they have a hard question, maybe try to answer it. Immediately after the war, there were many explanations put forth for how the Holocaust could happen. And probably the most prominent of them all was always about something about the Germans. Maybe the Prussian upbringing and the militaristic nature of the German people, or the German people were brainwashed by the propaganda, and this is why they became involved as murderers. For a long time, people were kind of stuck in trying to understand something very specific about Germans. And I think the big breakthrough in trying to understand who perpetrators were, those that were anything from the actual murderers to people that in some way were complicit or enjoyed the murders, today the way we use that term, probably came in 1992 when Professor Christopher Browning wrote a very important book called Ordinary Men. And in that book, he looked at a group of Germans, older men. These were people who were not young recruit soldiers, but they were a reserve police battalion from Hamburg, and there were men who were, many of them were older. You know, they were 30s and even into the early 40s, which is a little older to be a soldier. And he tried to understand how this unit of men became very accomplished killers, which is what happened to them when they were sent to Poland in 1942, and they became involved in murder, and they killed tens of thousands of Jews and were employed in rounding up tens of thousands more to be sent to camps where they were killed in the camps. And he tried to understand who these people were. It was all based on court records that had to do with this unit that were when some of the men were put on trial in Germany. And he talked about lots of factors, things that people weren't really thinking about so much, but talking about the men. And he talked about things like conformity, you know, not trying to be different from everybody else. If we all have to do it, I also have to do it. He talked about men who didn't want to show that they were weak because this is the job we were given and so that I have to do this. He talked about some of the men who did this because they wanted to advance and they wanted to distinguish themselves in the unit so they would advance in the hierarchy. He gave all kinds of reasons that were about the men, about the individual men, I think. And again, it could have been any combination of those factors came up in his book. He also talked, of course, about the fact that there's a Nazi ideology behind all of this, a view of the world that has to do with this. But his explanation in 1992 was taken by many people and is still used a lot today to try and put forth the idea that almost anybody could become a killer given a certain situation and who they are. What I want to do is talk about a little different approach. And the approach comes from a book about Eichmann that came out quite a few years, maybe 10 years ago now, by, unfortunately, my friend, the late Professor David Cesarani from Royal Holloway in London. And I want to read you something he wrote in the book, and that's what I'm going to try and explain to you a little bit this morning. About Eichmann, who's really Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the icons of the Holocaust. I mean, people don't always have a lot of name recognition. They know Hitler, and maybe they know Eichmann. Maybe some of them know Mengele. They've heard those names as the murderers. Eichmann, of course, was the guy who eventually was in charge with the logistics of sending around the trains and the deportations, and also became involved in the field in the rounding up of Jews in Hungary in 1944. That's part of what he did. So he says this about Eichmann, which I think it's true about perpetrators in general, we can say this. He says, the key to understanding Adolf Eichmann lies not in the man, but in the ideas that possessed him, the society in which they flowed freely, the political system that pervaded them, and the circumstances that made them acceptable. So I'll read it again. Understanding Eichmann is the ideas that possessed him. What was in his head? What was he thinking? The society in which those ideas flowed, because he didn't make them up. They were out there, right, those ideas. The political system, because you can have ideas, but if the system doesn't do something that allows you to act on those ideas, right, in this kind of way, then you have to understand that as well. And the circumstances that made the murder acceptable, that it became something that was acceptable to do. I want to deconstruct this idea now. And so I'm going to go a little far afield and talk to you about a lot of different things, which are very much background factors, in my opinion, for how to understand who these people are and to address the question that was asked about Christian Europe and about how people became murderers and what they were doing. There's a public discourse we can always talk about in any country, right, in any area, and there's a public discourse going on between World War I and World War II in Germany and other places in Europe. But particularly in Germany, we'll start with. There was a lot of anti-Jewish ideas that very much predated World War I, right? Anti-Semitism, which is the word we use for the hatred of Jews, has a very long history. And many of the ideas, these anti-Semitic ideas about who Jews were, stereotypical ideas, and of course ideas not based in any reality, were out there. And they were strong, and again, they had very deep roots all the way back from certainly medieval world into the pre-modern world, all kinds of ideas about Jews. To that was added something very important, that was racial thinking that came along in the 19th century, this idea that you could understand human behavior and human civilization through the physical person, right? And that you could break them up. And the way people spoke about races in the 19th century and into the World War II period, they spoke about them in ethnic and national units, right? So there was an Italian race or a German race or an English race or a Jewish race. And so they spoke about them in those ways. And this racial view that race through race you can understand the world, understand everything about it by understanding, again, this physical being of the people that then affects their behavior and what they do. And so that's a very important underlying idea. The Nazis certainly didn't invent it, and it's very strongly there. If you want to understand what the discourse is in Germany, the discussion in Germany, the racial discussion is that the Germans are a group of people who have come out from India through Iran and into Europe, and they call themselves, they're the Aryans. The Aryans, again, rooted way back in India, coming through there. And unlike most people you might see in India today, these were blonde and blue-eyed people, not darker skinned and darker haired people, and they had come through. And to say it very succinctly, they believed that these were the people who created human civilization. These were the people who did all the important things to bring about human civilization, and they ended up in Northern Europe, and they are called the Nordic Aryans or the Teutons. They have different names for them in the way they talk about them. And they essentially are seen to be as, again, the best of the races. Other races are inferior. The discourse with the long tail of anti-Semitism sees the Jews as the anti-race. They're the opposite. If the Nordic Aryans are the creators, the Jews are the destroyers. And so that's part of what's going on. People are thinking, how they're understanding the world. Again, it's not that everybody is thinking these things, but they're ideas that are out there and a lot of times being discussed. And so they're very common ideas. And this is a 19th century idea that's continuing into World War I, into the interwar period, and again, into the war period itself. Another important idea that comes along, which is very much related to this in Germany, is about the authentic German peopleness. They call it the Volk in German. And it's about that there are people who are tied to their land, and their land is part of who they are, and the language is all tied into who they are. And the truth is, it really is something that's going back to an idea about Germany's been made a state only at the end of the 1800s, 1870s. It becomes a nation, Germany. And who are the Germans? Who are we? And so there's this idea that we're defined by our language and by our land, and then some of this is also tied into that we're defined by our race. And these are ideas, again, that are all there. And the Jews within this discourse are really seen as outsiders by most people, even though Jews might have been living in German lands for hundreds and hundreds of years. And once they were given equal rights throughout the course of the 19th century, Jews felt very German and patriotic, and they were very involved in German culture and the language, of course, but many people still said, no, these are outsiders, and they're not really a part of us. And that's very much a part of the discourse that's going on. As I said, the Nazis didn't invent the idea that these Jews in some way are the anti-race or an evil race or an evil group of people. As I say, they have very, very deep, deep ideas that go all the way back, again, into the pre-modern world. For the Nazis and for those that then adopted their view of the world, that you understand the world through race, and that race is the key to things, again, the Jew is seen as the other, and he is the classic other in the way they understand things. He's not part of us. He's really not part of us. And this idea, again, is not confined to Germany. You can see it in other places and other times. Again, other places in the course of the 20th century, the Jews are seen as the other as well. And again, I don't know how much you follow news, but sometimes these ideas are still out there. That is, nations, some of the post-communist nations are talking about who we are. The Jew is still seen as the other. He's not quite part of us. So you hear voices like that sometimes as well, that they're not really a part of our society. And so, again, this is very much an understanding of who we are and who they are. A we and they, and us and them idea of many things. I'm just trying to cut because we don't have a lot of time. Another important thing that's part of the public discourse, especially after World War I, has to do with the Russian Revolution. You know, October 1917, the Bolsheviks, as they're called, the communists, come into power in the Russian Empire, as it were, in Russia. And many people see this as something Jewish. The truth is that the right-hand man of Lenin is a Jewish man named Trotsky. And of course, it's also true that Marx, upon who the ideas are based, was a Jewish person, right? The Bolshevik Revolution, of course, was not something that Jews ran or that they were the majority or anything near it. There were some Jews involved, of course, but primarily it's not a Jewish phenomenon. But many people saw it as something very Jewish. And they conflated the idea of Bolshevism with Jews. And so that into the 1920s and into the 1930s, where there's a lot of unrest in the 1920s after World War I, in the immediate post-World War I period, there's a number of Bolshevik revolutions outside of Russia. I don't know how much you've heard of some of these things, but there's a Bolshevik regime that comes in Hungary in 1919. And the foreign minister of that regime was a man named Belakun, who had a Jewish father. So again, this putting Jews together with the Bolsheviks, right? And in Germany, there were two revolutions that happened again, and all of these were put down strongly. And again, there were some Jews that were high profile involved in these things. And so the idea became, again, that this Bolshevism is a Jewish thing, and Bolshevism is something that we're very afraid of and that we don't want. And Jews and Bolshevism go together. And it's a very strongly held idea. And again, even through today, you can still hear people talking about it. It's a whole different subject. But were we to talk about some of the ways people are trying to manipulate history today for ideological reasons, this is an idea that comes up, not infrequently still, in some of the former communist countries. To the opposite side, the Jews were seen as the plutocrats. The plutocrats are the capitalists who are out of control. The really wealthy capitalists, right? In America, we know who these really wealthy capitalists were. We have people like Carnegie and others that were very, very wealthy people. And they had tremendous power coming into on the cusp between the 19th and 20th century. And there was a big push here against all of the cartels and everything else that happened. Government passed all kinds of laws eventually in order to limit their powers. So the plutocrats were often seen as people who were very evil and bad for society. And once again, Jews are often mixed in with this too, because there were some wealthy Jewish families in Europe. The Rothschilds are the most famous, of course. When the French wanted to build the Suez Canal, they borrowed their money from the Rothschild family. They were very wealthy. So there's also mixed that Jews are the plutocrats, and this rampant capitalism, this horrible evil, is also ascribed to Jews in part of the public discourse. So they're the Bolsheviks on the one hand, they're the capitalists on the other, or the out-of-hand capitalists, and that's very much a part of what that discourse is. Of course, in Germany, particularly after World War I, there's terrible socio-economic problems. They lost the war, they had to pay tremendous reparations for having been tagged with having started the war and caused all the destruction, and they have to pay lots and lots of money over many, many years, and that's part of the problem. The other problem is that the German economy is quite destroyed by World War I, and there's terrible inflation that goes on. At some point in 1923, you would be paid money 3 times a day. You would fill up a basket or a wheelbarrow or something and run out to buy a loaf of bread because the price would go up in a couple of hours. So you have this social problems, economic problems. Germany stabilizes a bit into the later 20s, and then we have the stock market crash in New York, October 1929, and everything starts to dip everywhere, right? And the whole world's going into a depression pretty much because of this. So with the social unrest, that's also part of what's going on. Germany lost World War I, right? The German people didn't really understand what had happened. They didn't have the things we have today. No, they didn't have Instagram and stuff, and people taking pictures and posting on Facebook in real time what's going on, of course. And they didn't have news. They didn't really understand. The reports back in Germany always were, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. Although by near the end of the war, there's already problems of not enough food and other things in Germany. But still the feeling that we're winning, and then boom, suddenly we lost. Of course, there was no way they could have won the war, because once America came in with all of its economic might, wars are won by power, right? And you need a big backing, economic backing to win a war, certainly the kind of war World War I was, such a global thing. So America comes in, Germany couldn't have won, but the German public thinks we're winning, 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 and then boom, we lose. And they blame their loss. And then the signing of the treaties, again with the reparations, they blame that on people who betrayed them. We lost the war because we were betrayed. And who betrayed us? It was the left, because it was the more leftist people who came into power afterwards and set up the Weimar Republic that would come in, and it was the Jews. So the Jews were tied into this as well. So from all these angles, you're seeing these anti-Jewish attitudes that are very much a part of the public discourse. Once again, not that everybody has these ideas, but they're ideas that are out there, and they're commonly discussed, and many, many people will hold them, of course. The Nazi Party came on the scene at the end of World War I. It really was created in 1919. And slowly they formulate their ideas and what they want. And if you want to ask what's the real goal of the Nazi Party, first it wants to come into power, of course, but once it's in power, what's it trying to do? It's trying to do two things. The first thing it wants to do is to redress the loss of World War I, where Germany was humiliated, so they felt, where other people told Germany what it would do and how it would live. And they wanted to make Germany strong. They wanted to make Germany in what today you and I would call a superpower. They wanted to make Germany so strong that when somebody tried to tell it what to do, they could say, go jump in the lake. We don't need you. That's what they wanted to do on one level, make Germany strong. The other thing they wanted to do was restructure Germany with this racial view of the world, and to make Germany racially strong as well. So those are maybe the two main ideas that the Nazis wanted to do. So they also wanted to do something else within Germany and the Nazis in the view of the world. They wanted to, we can almost call it, they wanted to bring in new values and get rid of some old values based on this view of who the Germans are racially, the importance of the people, what you need to do to make Germany strong. And they came to want to replace the values of what we would call a Judeo-Christian society, right? The values based upon the Ten Commandments and the Bible, right? The values of which most of the Western world, comes out of those values. And they wanted to replace them with the value that the most important thing was the nation and the race, and those were what were most important, not other things we might talk about in those other values about preservation of human life and as the Ten Commandments would tell you, don't steal, don't do this, don't do that. Everything's justified in the Nazi view of the world for the good of the race and for the good of the people. And there's really an attempt to shift values. And that's very much what they're about as well. And a lot of people, again, buying into this idea that we need to adopt these new values. These are the values that we want. And again, the ultimate value is that of the race and the people and the nation, and to do what we need to make it strong and preserve it, us. And that also means with a racial view of the world that we're superior and others are inferior, that other people count less. And we don't have to take them into consideration the same way we consider ourselves. We need to care for ourselves. Those other people, they're not as important. And that's, again, very much a part of what people are thinking in this period between the wars and then after the Nazis actually come into power in the year 1933. When the Nazis came into power, we can't go through all the history, but they begin doing things in Germany to rearm themselves and to strengthen themselves and to assert themselves again, and eventually they will go into places, territories, and take them over, first without a war, going into Austria in 1938, and going into part of Czechoslovakia in 1938 as well, and then dismembering Czechoslovakia and taking another piece of it in 1939, and then finally on September 1st, 1939, they will attack Poland, right? And we'll have the war in Poland. And the World War II breaks out in Europe, September 1st, 1939. So the Nazis then break out into the war. And how are they explaining the war to themselves, and how are many German people seeing it? Well, they're saying that what this war is all about is, is that Germany only wants its rights, what belongs to it. They want back what we had, what was taken from us with the agreements of World War I. We only want our rights. They would say Germany's peace-loving. Germany doesn't want this war. It's the British and the French who are the warmongers, and we have to protect ourselves against them. And that's why that's what the wars are about. We're peace-loving. If everything was okay, we would not go to war. That's how they're presenting themselves. And they're saying this is a just war. The war is important because we have to redress an injustice. That's what this war is all about. Poland, right? Parts of Poland had been Germany beforehand. There was something called East Prussia. I mean, these are our lands. And actually, we have the right to have more of Poland. I mean, we need it for ourselves in order to be strong. This is all justified, what we're doing, and it's a just war. And also, one of the most important things they would be saying is that this will be the last war. Our fathers, our older brothers, they fought World War I. And now we have to go to war, but our sons won't have to go to war. We must fight this war so it will be the last war. So this is also very much a part of the public discourse of how they understand themselves and what they're doing and why they're going to war. The persecution of the Jews, of course, and the violence against the Jews doesn't just start with the war. The Nazis come into power in 1933. And if I have to explain what they're doing to the Jews in a very succinct way, in the first 5 years, 1933 to 1938, they're isolating the Jews, they're passing laws in which take the Jews out of society as best as they can, and they're trying, and they take over property as time goes on and other things. And really what you could say is that they're isolating Jews with the idea that the Jews should feel they have no place in Germany, so they'll get up and leave. If you have to really break it down. By 1938, and you heard in the film as well, there's the violent riot against the Jews, Night of the Broken Glass. And that shows a new policy that's going on, one of much more violence against Jews in Germany. But even before that, there was violence against Jews. It wasn't orchestrated violence, it wasn't organized violence usually, but there was violence. And some of the people who suffered the worst violence, Jews who were suffering the worst violence in those first years, were actually children. Because we tend to think the Nazis came into power and the kids had to leave school. But that's not what happened. Jewish kids were in school with other German kids. I mean, unless their parents took them out and the Jewish community began creating more and more alternate schools for them. But you could still study in the school in your town or in wherever you were, your neighborhood, until the Night of the Broken Glass, till 1938. But there's tons of violence against kids in school. Somebody said something about bullying. Bullying. I mean, not just by the kids, bullying by the teachers. Because the teachers that are adopting the Nazi view of the world, they're bullying the kids as well. Tremendous violence is going on. And of course, there's street violence and other things happening. But then the Night of the Broken Glass, that really is the symbol of much more violence against Jews. Now, the Nazis have set up something else early on. They set up concentration camps. They didn't set them up for Jews, they set them up for political opponents. And the concentration camps had some Jews always from the beginning, but Jews weren't the biggest group in them, but they were set up in order to get rid of what they perceived could be the opponents in their society, real opponents and perceived opponents. And the idea of a concentration camp in the beginning is to break people. That's what they're doing in those camps. And they're violent places, but they become more and more violent as time goes on. And they reach a new high just a little bit before the Night of the Broken Glass, in which the German courts allow prisoners who have been now gone through the justice system and are supposed to be executed. The concentration camps can become venues of execution for those prisoners in 1938, and that opens the door to a lot of extrajudicial executions that will go on in those camps. And so there's a big difference now in the violence of the concentration camps right around the time that Jews were being put in them, which is part of the Night of Broken Glass, as my good friend David Silberklang told you in the film. That's part of what's happening at that time. So the violence is a part of what the Nazis are all about, and it's escalating as time goes on. And by the time we have the war in Poland in 1939, war is brutal, and it's a very violent thing. And there's tremendous violence against civilians that go on there. Polish civilians and Jews within the Polish civilian society. 60,000 people die in the first months in Poland, civilians, of which about 9,000 are Jews, right? There's just a lot of violence going on there as part of the war. So that's also something that you have to look at, part of the factors here, the brutality, the violence that's going on as well. And this is all happening before World War II breaks out, then into World War II as well. Okay, I don't look at my notes and then I want to look at them to see, and I'm already a couple of pages ahead. Okay. If we talk about what's going on in Poland, right, in the first phase, and we'll talk about it a lot more, I'm going to give you a lecture about it later on, The Nazis are looking solutions to how to deal with this large Jewish population that they've gotten. And again, in the film, David said a few things, that they were pushing people out to Soviet territory. There was an idea of making a Jewish reservation near the town of Nisko, or near Lublin, in an area called Nisko. There was an idea that was floated later on in 1940 to send Jews to Madagascar. Again, I'm going to mention these things later on when I talk to you tomorrow about ghettos. But another idea that they have is, again, to separate and isolate Jews within the communities they're living in throughout Poland in Jewish living districts, and these become the ghettos. And so that's also part of what's happening here. And the ghettos are not per se a violent place in the beginning. I mean, the Germans aren't going in and beating up people too much really in ghettos, but ghettos are a place where the violence is in a different way, I guess you could say, because people are suffering from the ill treatment in general, that not enough food, crowdedness, and other things, and there's a lot of death that will happen in the ghettos fairly quickly because of the very bad situation that's going on there. So that's what's happening. Jews, again, are being subjected to this as well. By 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, in the summer of 1941, this is a very, again, David said this in the film, it's a very ideological war. Jews are Bolsheviks, Bolsheviks are Jews, the Nazis are afraid of Bolshevism. Bolshevism is really the antithesis ideology as far as they're concerned, and it's the enemy ideology, right? So when they're fighting the Soviet Union, it's an ideological war against this worldview that they hate, and again, the Jews are part of that worldview. And as they enter the Soviet Union, began the systematic mass murder of Jewish men, Soviet political commissars, they're called, the political officers in the Soviet army, and also what we colloquially call the gypsies, the Roma Sinti tribes that they encounter. They file reports about who they're killing. And we know from the reports that they're killing 95% Jews and some of those others. And by summer of 1941, they expand, by August of 1941, they've expanded to Jewish men, women, and children. And the shooting is all going on. So we talk about that the systematic mass murder is now beginning at this point, right? And as I said before in the beginning, Christopher Browning wrote this important book talking about how men could get involved in this murder, looking at all kinds of things about being part of a group, right? And the kinds of things that can bring you to become a murderer because you're part of that group and that's what their job is. But if we look at some of these other ideas that I've been talking about, when German soldiers entered Soviet territory and they saw Jews and they began murdering them, part of it had to do with some of the things we were talking about before. They had to defend themselves against the Jews, right? They're defending themselves. They're defending Germany. They're murdering Jews because they're defending Germany. And we see in letters that some of these soldiers wrote home that this is how they explain themselves. And they say, you know, if we don't kill them, they're going to kill us. We have to do this. It's preemptive. We must do it. These are our avowed enemies, and we have no choice. They'll do this to us. That's why we have to do it. So we kill men, women, and children. There's one of the mass murderers was a man named Otto Ohlendorf. And Otto Ohlendorf was in charge of one of the biggest units that was involved in killing. There were 4 very big killing units in the Soviet Union called Einsatzgruppen, and he was in charge of one of them. And he was put on trial after the war. And they asked him the question, did you kill Jewish children? And he explained himself. He said, yes, they were being the children of parents who had murdered. We had to murder them because otherwise they would take revenge on us. So he's logical, right? He has a logic as to why he's killing children. It's, again, to defend ourselves. We have to kill these Jewish children. Otherwise, they will rise up and kill us. In the summer of 1941, the murder begins. The Nazis have not yet adopted it as a general policy for everywhere. That's something that's going to happen depending upon which scholar you're reading, either in October 41, thereabouts, or maybe early in 42. They have an overall policy that they now adopt that we call the final solution, which is about murdering all the Jews everywhere, basically. But in that summer and autumn of 1941, there's lots of local factors that have to do with murder and why murder is going on. And it's becoming more and more acceptable, even if it's not a general policy. There are these roving units that are shooting Jews, but also in many localities, they begin shooting Jews as well. Jews are murdered in some places, and others are herded into ghettos, closed-off areas in the Soviet territories. And then sometimes murder hits those ghettos. And sometimes, again, for essentially what could be very practical reasons, pragmatic reasons from a Nazi point of view. For example, in a town called Stanislavov, in October of 1941, 10,000 Jews were murdered. What's the background to it? It's right at this point that the Germans also began deporting Jews from Germany to the east. And some Jews from Germany were scheduled to be sent, not yet directly to a camp. Many of them were sent to various city ghettos that had been set up. And so one group was supposed to be sent to Stanislavov. There was already a ghetto in Stanislavov, but it was a certain size. And the local commanders were very interested in the idea of murdering Jews. They liked that idea. They thought that murdering Jews would help them for all those other reasons we said. They're our enemies. We have all these ideas about them. But they had another very pragmatic reason they were thinking about. There's only so much food. And the Jews don't produce, because that's their stereotype, that Jews don't know how to work. They're useless eaters. We don't really need them. They're not going to help us with anything. And besides, we have to put new Jews who are coming to us, and we don't have room for them. And so the first mass murder in Stanislavov occurred on the background that we have to kill the local Jews in order to make room for the other Jews. And essentially, eventually, we have to kill all those Jews anyway because they're not good for the economy. They don't help anything. They're just there, and they're our enemies and all those other reasons. And so let's murder them. So there's no order that comes from Hitler or from Berlin or any place else that says you have to murder these Jews. But murder is now this acceptable thing that's going on. And local commanders have a lot of leeway about deciding how to run their areas. And so these commanders in Stanislavov say, now is the time to murder these Jews. Let's do it. And it becomes one of the earliest large mass murders that occurs in the Soviet territories. So murder becomes an acceptable idea for people. It becomes a possible way of dealing with things, with solving a problem where Jews are involved in some way by murdering them, right? That becomes a very acceptable idea for many people. The acceptability of the idea of murdering people is brought out very clearly in a very, very good book. It's a book called Hitler's Furies, and it's written by Wendy Lauer, who has just now become the director of the research part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And Wendy wrote this book. It's about several women, German women, who become caught up in murder. And she talks about the following story in this book. There's a woman named Erna Petri. And Erna was a farmer's daughter from Thuringia, which is a place sort of in the middle of Germany today. It was in East Germany before Germany was united again. And she was from a farming house, a farming family. And she married a man named Horst Petri. And Horst Petri became an officer in the SS, in that elite unit, military unit of the Nazi army, right? The SS, the Nazi regime. And he was associated with a very senior Nazi who was the head of agricultural things in something called the Race and Resettlement Office. And he was eventually stationed in Lvov. Lvov today is Lviv in the Ukraine. And it had a very large Jewish community in the Lvov area, and he was stationed there. And the Jews of Lvov, like all of these areas in Soviet territory, into 41 and into 42, they were murdered in ghettos and they were killed in great numbers. On a summer day in 1943, she was riding in her horse-drawn carriage nearby because they were living in a very beautiful estate on the edge of the town. And she noticed 6 children hiding by the roadside. And she realized that they were Jewish children. And so she asked the carriage driver to stop, and she offered to put the children into her carriage, and they came in. She said, "Don't be afraid," right? And she took them home, and she fed them and treated them quite nicely. And then she told them to come out with her, and she took them to the edge of her property, and she took out a pistol and shot each one in the back of the neck. She became a murderer, this woman. Why would she become a murderer? Farmer's daughter from Thuringia. How does this happen? And that's part of the question. How does it happen? Well, it's quite clear she buys into what's going on. She thinks that this is what is the right thing to do. This is what her husband's engaged in as an SS officer in persecution of Jews, murdering Jews. And these 6 children, they're Jews who have gotten out of the net somehow. And that's the policies. They're being murdered, and she's a patriot, and that's what she wants to do. She wants to do what she needs to do. She's not a mean person in the sense that she brought them into her carriage. She brought them home, and she fed them first. I mean, there was something very normative about that, right? I mean, if you saw 6 little children somewhere that were kind of left somewhere, maybe you'd bring them home and want to deal with them. So there's something very normative. She doesn't seem like a sadist, or to me anyway, when I read the story, that's not how I read her. But she's very imbued with what the system's doing and what her husband's doing. And she sees this as her duty, and she murders the children. And when you really think about it, had she not been posted in Lvov, or had she not married Horst Petri, she probably never would have become a murderer. There wasn't something in her psychology to make her a murderer. She wasn't a psychopathic person, right? But she bought into all of these ideas. That's how I understand her. It's called Hitler's Furies. Now, we tend to think of the Nazi murder machinery as a very well-oiled machine, right? With Hitler on the top and giving orders and everybody following orders. That's not how it worked. We like to think of it that way, but actually the Nazi regime in many ways was very, very dysfunctional. It really didn't work the way people think it did. Again, right after the war, that's how everybody sort of understood it, but that's not really how it worked. There's a couple of ways to try to understand it. Ian Kershaw, who wrote 2 very important volumes on Hitler, talks about Hitler would give amorphous orders of some sort, and people would then try to fulfill them and work towards fulfilling his orders as they understood them. So it wasn't so clear always, but people did it, and again, on many, many levels, they would try and do this to fulfill working towards the Fuhrer, working towards Hitler. That's one way to understand it. The way I understand it, or the way I try to explain it, is this. The Nazis' policy against the Jews, anyway, we could see as a ship, right? It's a ship that's sailing, say, from Europe to the Americas, and it's heading for New York. But it gets blown off course, and it ends up in Charleston. And on board, there's a lot of dissension. People are fighting with each other, and they're arguing about who's going to run this and who's going to do that, and who's going to be the captain, and who's going to be the bosun, and who's the first mate, whatever. But the ship still goes in the basic general direction. It doesn't get exactly where they want it to, but it goes pretty close to where it wants to do. So that's sort of what the Nazis are all about with the Jews. Once they have a policy called the final solution, they want to get to the murder of the Jews, but there's a lot of dissension and leeway and things that happen. It doesn't happen all in a totally organized way, even if there are elements of it that, again, at first glance, look like they're very organized. And as I said in Stanislavov, local people have a lot of way for initiative and for leeway to do things. And their responsibility then is great. It's not just responsibility that goes with the top. Responsibility filters down. How deep does responsibility filter down? Deep into society. When Jews are being deported from Germany in October of 1941, their possessions are being auctioned off. And people go to auction houses to buy those possessions. So they buy things like spinning wheels, and they buy whatever they buy. They buy socks and underwear of deported Jews. And they know the Jews are being deported. They don't necessarily yet know what their fate's going to be, but they know that their neighbors have been pushed out of Germany. They've been persecuted for many years. Now they're being pushed out for Germany. These things are left behind. It's a war. There's scarcity. The produce is reasonable, good priced, and they buy it. So that there's a responsibility of sorts that really filters all the way through society. And again, the men in the field, as far as murder is concerned, they have leeway. They can decide all kinds of things here about what to do and how to do exactly how it's happening in many, many instances. So that's an important thing to understand about these perpetrators. So there's these ideas, right, that are out there, that the Jews are our enemies. The Jews have caused the loss of World War I. The Jews are racially a problem. The Jews are hurting us as Bolsheviks. They're our main enemies, or they're the plutocrats that are hurting our society. All of these ideas. There's lots of ideas out there about who the Jews are. There's a system that comes into power, a party that comes into power, who has these goals about dealing with the Jewish issue and trying to solve it. And then there's a war, and under the war, all the brutality. And then murder becomes an instrument of dealing with the Jews, of a way of trying to solve this problem of what do we do with these Jews who are so dangerous to us. People buy into it and they justify what they do in many, many, many different ways. So it's not that they've been brainwashed, and it's not that they have a Prussian upbringing. There's so many things that somebody can lean on or grab in order to justify why he's doing what he does, including Erna Petri, who I think justifies what she does because this is what's happening around her, this is what her husband's doing, and this is the policy, and that's how she understands it, and she's a patriot, and she has to do the same thing. And that's how maybe she justifies what she does, is my guess. It's not just the Germans. I want to finish up quickly because I want to leave some time for Shani. There's many partners in the murder. I mean, in many countries in Europe, it's not Germans who are murdering Jews, it's the locals. If you go to Latvia and to Lithuania, it's mostly local units under German command, or sometimes only loosely under German command. I mean, there are under them, but they have a lot of leeway too. They're involved in the murders. There's something called the Arais Commando in Latvia, who become the main murderers of the Jews of Latvia. And in other places, again, many, many locals have a role, if it's in shootings, and sometimes bringing Jews to the shooting sites and cordoning them off. They have a role in that way. When we talk about other parts of Europe, like France, and we talk about Hungary, the Jews are deported by the local police, basically, by the gendarmerie. They're the ones who are actually herding the people onto trains, and then now that they're being sent to the extermination camps that have been set up, 1942 onwards, they're sending the people there, and they have a very important role in the destruction of their Jewish communities, again, the locals. So why do the locals get involved? Again, there's really a cornucopia of reasons why they get involved. When you're talking about some of the territories that were under the Soviets for a while, the countries in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Poland, the Ukraine, the people there hated, some of them hated the Soviet regime. And they saw the Nazis as somebody that was going to come in and free them from the Soviet regime. And they became willing collaborators with the Nazis for a very large extent because of politics, because they wanted to regain their freedom. And the Nazis dangled it in front of them, although they really never were going to give any of these people real freedom, but that's what they thought. And so they latched on sometimes. And again, many of these people, again, had part of that discourse I talked about in other ways, anti-Jewish attitudes from all kinds of places. They considered, again, the Bolshevik regime that was so cruel to them as being a Jewish regime. And so dealing with the local Jews also was an issue of revenge sometimes for people. And then there were very simple reasons people could get involved in murder, and that has to do with greed, the most normal things. You deport your Jew, you tell the authorities about a Jew that's still hiding somewhere and maybe get his property. And that's a very standard thing. It's all through Europe, greed. That's a very important idea about what happens, that if you deal with these Jews in some way amongst you, then we get their property. And so many people get involved on that level as well. So again, there's so many things you could talk about, but they're normative in some ways and not, because they're normative, but the situation's extraordinary. Because maybe you're greedy about your neighbor's property, and in a normal world, maybe you'd even try to hurt him in some way to get that property, but you wouldn't murder him in his home necessarily knowing that you would not get punished for it, that it's okay to do it, right? And that's how you're going to get the property, or to hand them in and get the reward for handing them in or something, because the system's allowing you to do this more. So again, it's normative in a not normative world. So when we talk about ordinary men, well, everybody's human, and so there's certain ordinariness about all of us, but there's an extraordinary situation going on. And that's really what makes it so that you can't draw a line from what the Nazis happening to the Jews and the people perpetrating the crimes in World War II to anything you want to talk about today. A direct line. You can certainly see things you can talk about, but the direct line not, because the situation's different. So different, radically different, right? But looking at the perpetrators, we have to understand that there's a very complex situation going on, and people get involved for many, many reasons. And again, some of them are psychopaths, but most of them aren't, but some of them are. And mostly people get involved, again, for all these things. They can justify from many, many, many different directions why they do what they do. Again, I have lots of nice quotes and things I'm not going to read to you because we don't have time, and I want to give Shani some time to do her next step. But the murder of the Jews ultimately is something that the German Nazi regime starts, but it becomes a European enterprise. And it's something in which people throughout Europe become involved. Again, not everybody, obviously not, but significant amounts of people. And so it's part of what we have to understand, that we often just want to talk about the Germans. They say Prussian mentality or something, but there's a whole lot more to it, because it's a much wider swath of territory and peoples. And again, not that in every country that even a majority is involved in murdering Jews, of course, but many people are involved, lots of people, and there's a lot of complicity and different levels that goes on here that we have to understand that that's part of what's going on. And the locals have all kinds of reasons for this, some similar to what the Nazi Germans are talking about, and some they're more local ideas about what they need, local things that are happening to them, that are happening in their part of the world that influence them and make it so that murdering the Jews, again, becomes an acceptable idea, or handing them in, or enjoying their property, or whatever we want to talk about is acceptable. It becomes acceptable. And that goes back to what I said again, shifting of values. There's some values that we hold, right? I think American values, they're also in things like the European Union has values like this that they put forth officially, which respect people and their rights to live and their rights to property and pursuit of happiness and all of these ideas. These values are pushed aside and other values coming in to replace them. And we have to try and understand that as well, that this is a process that goes on. And it's not something that the Nazis can just push on people. It's something that people have to accept. And people accept it. And for, again, a cornucopia of reasons, I would call it. Okay, so yeah.
I want to highlight the two authors that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So one is, if you'd like to write this down, Wendy Lower, Lower. And for me, her book was groundbreaking because as a female, I always thought women wouldn't do that, you know.
All right.
I had the privilege of listening to her, hearing her talk about her research, how she accidentally fell upon these documents. That was not the purpose of her research. And so those of you that like doing research papers, I'm one of those nerdy people that like that. So here she was going down one path and she ended up going, whoa, almost like 360 degrees around. And her research was groundbreaking on women and their role during that period of time. And the other person that you spoke of blessed memory, was David, and I'm going to spell his last name, Cesarani, Cesarani, and his book you were referring to was about Eichmann.
Yes, and his new book, the one that was published right after he passed away, it's called The Final Solution, and I recommend it very highly. It's not a simple book. It is a book that has incorporated, and it was published, he passed away in 2015, and it was published a few months after he passed away, and it's probably the most up-to-date book that represents what this community of scholars understands about the Holocaust. But if I want to, I want to mention another book, which is a little easier to read, but also a good book. And I honestly haven't read the whole of it yet. I was starting to read it a couple of months ago and then put it aside. But it's by a man named Peter Hayes.
And can you spell us Hayes?
Yeah, I think it's H-A-Y-E-S.
That's correct.
Yeah, I spelled it
Hayes.
right. So Peter Hayes, and it's called Why. And he tries to explain some of what I was just talking to you about, why this all happened. And it's a little bit, it's a notch below in terms of its difficulty than David's book. And if you have the energy and if you have strong hands, because they're both heavy books, you might want to read them both.
I highly, stay right there a minute,
Okay,
please.
I'm right here.
I highly recommend Peter Hayes' book. Mary and I have both done some workshops using his book because that's the question you were asking earlier. This table gets all the A+, asking why, how, and that's why he titled his book Why. So before we move on, are there any pressing questions that you want to ask Dr. Rosette? Anything from his presentation? So I'm going to have the roving mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David.
Yeah. Rob.
Rob, I should know that. You just said David. Okay. I'm sitting here and listening, and it almost seems like you're justifying their behavior.
No, obviously not.
Right.
But trying to understand the logic of what people do in addition to anything that here is absolutely illogical. Because when, again, if a psychopath murders people, there's no logic to it.
Right.
But when a society decides it wants to murder people and people become very involved in it, people have to buy into it. Again, this idea that you could brainwash somebody and make them a murderer, well, I mean, I don't know, maybe in some of the science fiction movies that happens, but in reality, no, the people have to buy into it. They have to think that they have to agree with what they're doing. They have to justify it in some way. So what we're trying to do always is to get into their shoes. Because the other thing is that what we don't want to do is, you don't want to say these people are monsters, because then they're not human. They're humans that are doing this. So they do monstrous things, obviously, but they're human people doing this. And again, we want to get into their shoes. We want to, in Yad Vashem's museum, by the way, we present the perpetrators as black boxes. There's a black box with a picture of the perpetrator, right? A number of famous ones. But you can open the box. And the idea is you open the box and you learn something about this person, maybe Otto Ollendorf's testimony explaining why he murdered children. And you learn that he was also a doctor of law, this man. He was a very educated man. Because we want everybody to understand that these were people who were killing people. And they weren't monsters killing people. Again, they might have acted monstrously.
So maybe what needs to follow a lecture like this is understanding why of those who didn't buy into it. And when I talk to my college students who are without money, without means, a lot of them, and I say, you go to the grocery store and they give you the wrong change. You need the money. How many of you are going to put that change in your pocket because you need it more than ShopRite does? And how many of you are going to give the money back because it's the right thing to do? And until I tell them and explain to him why, first of all, the cashier comes out of their pocket, not necessarily ShopRite, but that we need to focus on those who didn't and what made them do the right thing when there were many, many. But you know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, so part of the answer, there's no one answer.
No,
of
I
course.
know.
A piece of the answer is what I said about values. There was a shift in values, but there are some values that are very important in our world, in our society, and I'm sure if we talked about it, everybody in the room would agree there are certain values that you need in order to have a well-functioning society that protects people. It's the people in the society. And again, we might disagree about a few pieces here and there, but we'd have a lot in common if we talked about it. But there was this shift of the values, again, about how the society should work, and some values that just fell apart and just got lost, we could even say. So that's part of the answer. That's the exact value you're talking about, right? The value of the honesty of that, you know, that if something happens, you need to be honest, and also to understand what the repercussions are if you're not honest about it. And, you know, that you're going to hurt somebody who shouldn't be hurt, perhaps, right? So that's part of it, the discussion. But again, it goes much wider than that. And I don't know, maybe over lunch or after lunch, we'll talk about it a little bit more.
The manipulation of the Germans to make them do what they did.
Well, again, I'm not so sure. I like to stay away from manipulation. I think that more, as I say, people buy into the ideas, and they do these things because they, at some point, think that this is what they should be doing, and that it's right to do it. There's a turning upside down of what's right and wrong, right? And a justification. As I say, in a sense, it's the ends justifying the means, right? And so their end is to create this strong Germany, this wonderful thing that they want to create for themselves, utopia for themselves. And it doesn't matter what we can do anything to do it because it's such a high value, we have to do this. And so that's part of it, right? And it's also a simplification of it, but it's part of it. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
And please, I want him to come in too, but our table talked about the small steps that allowed for these values to start really coming into the society. So that process you were talking about, there's no one answer to all this. It's so complex. But to see how a society changes, so by the time it's changed, you don't even realize that so many changes have gone on. I mean, it's that process that's happening.
Yeah. Well,
and I
it's a
thought
long
you did a
process.
brilliant job of just sort of giving us the sense of all the different things that would get people sort of going along with this program, if you will, or sort of, it's not that they're all brainwashed, it's not that they're all following one ideology. It seems to be so many different things coming in to play there. So, anyhow.
Yeah. Somebody else wanted to ask something? Yeah.
The point that you made, I forget your name, I'm sorry. Marcia, was a very good point, and it's something we talk about in my class. We use Browning's book in Ordinary Men. And as we're talking about like the tendency of some of the students to look at these as these are things that are excusing their behavior. And Browning, it's very important to, in the context of Browning's writing, and I got the quote from him because it's the one quote from his preface that really gets to the heart of, not excusing this. He had said in his book that,
Yeah, Ordinary Men.
Christopher
We talked
Browning's
about it.
Ordinary Men.
Christopher Browning, Ordinary Men.
And the quote is, I had to look it up because sometimes I paraphrase it and forget some words. But explaining is not excusing, understanding is not forgiving, not trying to understand the perpetrators in human terms would make impossible any history of Holocaust perpetrators that go beyond a one-dimensional caricature. And we talk about how sometimes we like our villains to have horns and fangs dripping with blood, and these were not that,
Right.
So it was very important in context of to really. And what was shocking for a lot of my students is to, and these are adult students, this is community college, so it's seeing that they themselves could even be, what's most powerful is they themselves could possibly be inculcated to do these sort of things, or have certain motivations to benefit from, the overall projects, which they might not be ideologically, Nazis, but they were encouraged to do this, for some other motivation.
Well, again, the idea that anybody could become a murderer, part of what I'm saying is yes and no, because there's still that very strong context of all of this. And that context is really what allows those people who buy into the ideas and to do it. And that context is specific to what's going on there. There can be a different context, something else going on, I don't know. But it's not just that today that's going to happen to you. It's not that your son or your daughter or somebody is going to become a mass murderer somewhere for some, I don't know why. But you need a lot of things to come into force here to create the kind of context where this can happen. And that's the complexity, I think, that, again, Chris's book was a very important, groundbreaking book, but I think we want to go to the next step, and we want to make sure that people understand where what's happening here, at least, that this very context I was talking about, all these different things going on, that it wasn't just that somebody was ordering, inculcating, whatever. There's a lot more happening here. But again, in another sense, it's still about people. As I say, all the history is about people. We're always talking about people. So we never want to forget we're talking about people, and as people, we all have something in common, right? We all have ways we think and do things, and there's a lot of things about us that are similar no matter where we are, or who we are, or when we lived, or anything else. So there is a certain commonality there, of course. Yeah. All right, I want to give Shani the mic because she's going to do something extraordinary. She's going to do something that takes an hour and do it in half an hour.
Yeah, I'll just look fast. For those of you who know me, it's not a challenge. But what we can do now is one of the big questions we have is education. How do we teach all of this stuff? So, a lot of the stuff that Rob introduced now, and we spoke about, the biggest challenge is we don't have enough time. So how do we make this accessible to our students? How do we explain this to our students in a way that we're not just saying it in one sentence because we don't have enough time? And we want to get our students to think, okay? And a few things that we all know that are crucial in education is working with primary resources, but also critical thinking. And critical thinking means that we want to have our students not confused, but at least challenged to think about things that happened and not give very simple answers to that because it's more complex than that. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do exactly that. We're going to be our own students, and we're going to be talking about a primary resource. In December of 1941, a group of 1,007 people were deported from Düsseldorf in Germany to Riga. Okay, you have to understand that from September of 1941, they started deporting Jews from Germany towards the east. And Rob had mentioned before Stanislavov, and it happens in other places. Lodz was one of the places, Riga was another place. Now, each group of Jews that was deported from Germany towards the east was escorted by a group of policemen and 1 officer, okay? In this specific case, and what you see here on the screen is a photo of people being deported on this transport. And each one of these officers was in charge of gathering the Jews, putting them on the train, and escorting it until their final destination. That for many of them was the final destination. Just to put things in perspective, about 28,000 Jews were sent towards Riga and Kovna in Lithuania. Out of 28,000 people that were deported, only 800 had survived the war. Okay, so the majority of the people, of the Jews from Germany that were deported to these areas were either executed immediately or died shortly after that, either because they were sent later on to the mass graves or died because of the conditions, okay? The commander or the officer in charge, his name was Solider. And when he finished this whole journey with these Jews deported to Riga, he wrote a report, a very meticulous, very long one. Usually people write reports, they're very condensed. He had a mission, he fulfilled his mission, and he wrote his report. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at this report, and we're going to try and study it, okay? Because this man who was, and that goes into what Rob said before, he joined the party, he was in his mid-30s. I think he was 36 when he joined the party, the SS. Okay, when he joined the SS, not the party. But he joined the party a few years later. In other words, he was not a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old teenager who was buying into this new idea. He had a family, well established even before. And what we're going to try to do is try to understand what we can learn from this document, okay? And later on, we're going to look at another document. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do in groups, you'll do it around the table. I'm going to ask you to read the document itself. Now, for that, you're going to use echoes and reflections, okay? You all have guides in your bags. And we're going to hear that noise a few times along our 2 days here of you guys pulling things out of your bags. So the document itself, you'll open. See, I would use mine, but my cover does no longer exist, so thank you. Page 234, okay? And what I'm going to ask you to do is to look at this document and answer these questions, okay? The questions of what are the main issues that Solider refers to in his report, okay? The other thing is what of the issues that were discussed here by Dr. Rosette are mentioned or help you understand the document in a certain way, okay? What is missing from the document? And I can add another thing, because we were originally in our plan, we were going to discuss anti-Semitism, which we will do later on today. But I'm going to ask you to see if you can find in the document the way he writes it or things that he doesn't write, okay? Can you find out or can you figure out what his attitude towards the Jews is, okay? So we're adding a fourth question. So what are the main issues, okay? What of the issues that were discussed here help us understand or even appear in the document, okay? What is missing? And can we, from the document, learn of his attitude towards Jews, okay? Now, it's a relatively long document. I'm saying this because some of you as teachers are going to say, oh my God, I cannot give this to my students to read. It's just way too much. Let's start by reading it, then we can decide if it's long enough or not long enough or too short for our students or, not too short, obviously, too long for our students. But let's start by reading the document, then we'll add another document and look to that, and that one we'll compare. 234. 6, okay. New edition, sorry about that. New edition, they added 2 pages, okay? So 236, I'm gonna ask you to work in groups in the table. We'll use the same captains, okay? Unless somebody quit and decided not to be a captain anymore. But I don't know if Gail lets that happen. So you have to stay the captain until the end of this day, okay? So these are the 3 questions. We'll take a little less than 10 minutes, okay? So to read together, I suggest reading out loud so you can mark out those questions anytime you come across, and then we'll move on to our next document. Okay. And as Gail always says, let's hear some noise in the room. And that is, how would you define Solider as a person, okay? If you had to, say a few words about him, what kind of person would you say he was? Okay, let's stop here for a second, okay? Remember, with your students, you're not going to be doing this, hopefully, this fast, okay? But I wanted to introduce another document that refers to this exact transport, Okay, so this is one angle, okay? This is the angle of the officer in charge and the report he hands in. By the way, I want to tell you about this document, a very important thing. First of all, it's not the only document we have that sums up or reports a transport, but this is the most detailed one, okay? And also this document was part of the documents that were part of the Eichmann trial. Eichmann was very instrumental in the transporting Jews from different places in the whole final solution operation. Well, he was a very significant role even before. And he was brought to trial in Israel. Actually, he was found, then kidnapped and brought to Israel. And he stood to trial in Israel, and it became a very, very meaningful trial. It was essentially, I would say, it was one of the first times that it became part of public discourse, enabling society to actually have an open discussion about it, because everything was very different until then. There were survivors talking about it, but it was more on a personal level. It wasn't a public discourse kind of issue, and that opened, in a way, the door to discussing the whole idea of Holocaust and Holocaust survival. So this document was part of the documents that were put together for the trial. I'm going to ask you to do another thing. In your bags, okay, in your goodie bags, as Gail calls them, you have another document, and that is the testimony of Hilda Sherman, who happened to be on that same transport, okay? And in her testimony, she discusses her experiences of this same transport. What I want you to do is look at this testimony, okay, and compare the two. What are the issues that she discusses? Okay? And how do you understand what's missing based on her testimony from the report you just read? Okay? So what are the issues that she deals with? Okay? What are her concerns? Okay? And what's different between these two documents that allows you to understand the transport maybe in a different way? Okay? And after this is in your bags, it's a two-sided thing. It says Hilda Sherman, and the other side you'll see a picture of Hilda Sherman. Okay? And once you guys finish reading that, or at least part of it, because I'm going to stop you in the middle because I want to hear you, okay? Once you finish or read some of it, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to try and hear from you guys, what is the added value of the testimony and what do we understand about the document, okay? So let's take a few minutes for that. It's not in the book, it's on the ECHO's website. That's where you have it as a handout. You can download it from the website, okay? And I will show you later on today where the Echoes and Reflections website is and where you can find all the handouts, including the Solid document that you can download for your students. So for the last 5 minutes that we have, okay, I do want at least two of you, let's have at least two tables share with us what they have learned based on these questions and what are the major differences between the documents.
No, when we looked at Hilda's story, you got the personalization. You saw it from the perspective of the victim and how the lack of knowledge of what was to come, where you look at the Nazi and you see everything is mechanical, everything is orchestrated. The view of the people that they were going to, even the idea that in Riga, you're going to the Catholic, what is going to become of me? What is going to be the next situation for us? She saw the beating, she felt the pain, she felt the thirst. He saw everything as, this is my job. This is what I do. This is the order in which we do it. So their stories, the perspectives are fascinating to see from both ends. Yes, but different perspective.
And you said, it's very different, but as educators, and somebody asked me before, what age group is this suitable for? If I were to recommend using it, I would say 11th, 12th grade. I definitely would not use it in middle school. I think it's too complex. There are a lot of things that you can't notice if there's no background, and it's hard to, analyze. It's a more complex document. You said they're very different, okay? If you had to, put your finger on what is the major difference, what is the importance of the difference, what would you say?
I'm sorry. That one is empowered and one has had her power taken away. So in that regard, how different they are. The authority versus the victim. I mean, we can take it apart in several different directions, but those would be the two that I would focus on if I was teaching this particular, which I will in class.
let's have another table and then we'll have a few more points that we want to make.
I wanted to kind of build on that point because it reflects something that we were talking about, which is, was this motivated by hatred or was it motivated by something else? And Salader is very businesslike, very matter of fact in how he details the transport. He doesn't mention the individuals or what's happening to them, the brutality and so on, whereas the personal account, thank you, Hilda, does mention that. Her name's right up on the screen. And so the difference, the difference is in that perspective. Is this motivated by hatred or something else? And we talked about the Elie Wiesel quote, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And that was kind of evident for us in comparing these two reports. The idea that the cleaning lady could have not revealed this hiding woman, but did. The idea that people, were in their windows, their curtains were moving, they saw what was going on, but they did nothing. And town to town, this same thing was probably going on. Salader is interested in moving 1,007 people from A to B. These individual people on the train are worried about their relatives and their friends, so they're trying to get letters out to warn them. Maybe not of their ultimate fate, they may not know that because they're saying, hey, make sure you bring, these kinds of shoes or these supplies, don't bring this, bring that. But it's this idea of the human story versus the not so human story. And I think that comparison is really important because as was mentioned earlier, not everybody was motivated by strong anti-Semitism. It was more of just a lack of empathy. And that is a huge lesson in teaching the Holocaust.
Thank you, but I want to refer to what you just said. Not everybody was influenced by anti-Semitism, and I asked the question before: does Salader's attitude towards Jews appear in the document or influence the way he does? And that's why when we were talking about secondary school or middle school, I said that I don't know if it's suitable because it does appear there. Now, the way he writes the document and the way he chooses, or what he chooses to put in his report is a choice, okay? So one way that could be the document could be dangerously looked at as a bureaucrat writing a report, a very dry report, a very, meticulous report of what happened, but part of our job is when we try to learn about the Holocaust and teach about the Holocaust is try to understand exactly what is not explicitly said there and what we know from other sources that enables us to understand the document, and that was what Rob was saying before, in the context of what was happening before, okay? Because, and I'm gonna leave this quote on for whoever wants to look at this during lunch break, just because we don't have enough time. Dr. Yaakov Lazovic, who did his research about the Eichmann operation, all the deportations, and he came to these, to this research thinking, that people, develop a certain indifference, or they can, it's a matter of you become part of a process and you can become, ignore other thoughts you have. It just can happen to anybody. He came to a very different conclusion at the end of his research. And he said basically is people do a lot of things because they want to gain power, because they want to take control. But there are always red lines and borders. And the question is, where is the border? And he says, people don't become murderers just because they want to gain an opportunity, because they want to be promoted in a job. There, people know to distinguish between right and wrong. And if they decide not to distinguish or decide to take the step and become part of a murderous operation, we can't say that they didn't know they were part of the process. Okay? So we'll stop here. It's an overview, just a way of introducing and discussing a little bit in depth the issue of perpetrators through an angle of an individual and what does it mean.
Another part for your meatballs. Thank you, Rob and Shani. This morning, Leonard Hammerschlag, we talked behind your back. If you could just give a wave. This is Leonard, and remember I told you about the essay that his mother wrote as a witness to Kristallnacht in Frankfurt am Main. So Leonard will be sitting at the table. Also, we spoke behind your back this morning, if you both would stand. This is Maddie and Harvey Ravinsky. Please stand, just so everybody can meet you. And the Ravinskys have funded our program called Adopt a Classroom. So many of you, how many of you have used their classroom sets? I know Liz, and almost every table has at least one teacher. Thank you. And today they have helped us to be able to give you these materials, including the books that you have. And of course, Leonard's a generous donation to our university has helped to fund this. And if there was a trumpet, I would go da-da-da-da. So we have an announcement to make that we, within the past 2 weeks, received a very generous donation of $250,000 from Leo Ullman. Where's Leo? Did he? Oh my, he was just here. So, okay, is Leo Ullman here? No, okay. I don't know where he went, but, and we will be expanding the facilities of our Holocaust Resource Center, and we will be displaying his artifacts. So each of the survivors will be sitting behind their books, and let's do it this way. So I'm going to call Leo Ullman up, who is now going to tell us his life story. He's going to share it with us. And Leo, you were not here when I made the announcement about a half an hour ago that we recently received a gift of $250,000 from Mr. Ullman to expand our Holocaust Center, and some of the artifacts that you're going to be seeing today, we're going to be building display cases so that when your students come to visit us, they'll be able to learn the story of the Ullman family who were from the Netherlands. So if you would all please warmly welcome Leo Ullman.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you all for being here. My story basically starts, I'm going to start it in 1932, which was a few years before I was born. In 1932, my father left Germany. He finished high school, and there wasn't much of a future there for him at that point. So he came to Holland. His family had been engaged in the manufacture of silk handkerchiefs. His mother was actually Dutch. He came to Holland, and he got a job in the largest Dutch department store, the Bijenkorf, which is sort of equivalent to Macy's. And he became, among other things, a rug buyer. He met my mother through a cousin who also worked at the department store. My mother at the time was a first-year student at the University of Amsterdam. She too was 18 years old, and she was already engaged to another man, but my father, a swimmer, water polo player, a little taller than I and much better looking, was able to arrange to have her break up that engagement, and they became married in 1936. My mother's family was quite well-to-do. They had been assimilated in Holland from generations or 4 generations. They lived in a beautiful home right near the Rijksmuseum. They had chauffeurs, they had maids. They lived a very good life. Her father and his brother had a diamond cutting business in Holland. And Amsterdam at the time was probably the world's leading manufacturer of cut diamonds. In 1936, they married, and shortly thereafter, my father arranged to become a trainee for retail properties in the US. So he and my mother traveled to the US, and there they went to Boston, worked for Filene's. They went to Atlanta and worked for Rich's. They went to Wanamaker's here in Philly. They were all over the US, and in 1938 and 1939, Hitler started acquiring the Eastern European countries of Austria and Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. My parents at that time decided that they would come back. Thank you very much. I think it was that brownie, which was delicious. My parents decided to come back to Holland, thinking that they should be with their families, but knowing in their minds that Holland was neutral in World War I, and accordingly they were confident that Holland would not be attacked by the Germans. And as late as September of 1939, Hitler told everyone that they would not attack Holland. Notwithstanding that promise, on May 10th, 1940, the Germans bombed the city of Rotterdam, which was then and now one of the most important ports of the world. They bombed Rotterdam to smithereens, killing tens of thousands of people, leaving many more homeless. And as a result, they took over Holland in 4 days. Holland's military was minimal, and again, they were confident that Hitler would not attack Holland. We, at that point, had a chance to get out. Many members of my family did ultimately get out, but I want to tell you a bit about our life in Holland, because we didn't get out. My parents and my grandmother, one of my grandmothers, and I went to a fishing port where you could buy passage to England if you paid in coins, because paper became immediately worthless. And during those first couple of days after the bombing of Rotterdam, you could go to the ports and buy your way to England and then get to the US or Canada if you were lucky. We went to one of these ports. It was complete chaos. There were rumors that big boats would take people away. There weren't any. And my parents decided, and my grandmother decided, that we should go back to our apartment. I had an earache, my grandmother had a toothache, or vice versa, and we'd come back and try it another day. Of course, shortly thereafter, the Germans sealed the borders, and we were never able to get out. For a while, life in Amsterdam was tolerable. For the first couple of years, we were able to survive basically because we had each other. What happened was that in 1941, in February 1941, not all that long after the war started, there was a public strike led by the Dock Workers Union, a socialist union, and it became a national strike in support of the Jews. The Jews at that time were being subjected to various decrees, and I'll talk about that, but the dock workers struck in support of the Jews. It was the only strike in any country of Europe in support of the Jews. The problem with the strike was that the German retribution was brutal. As a result of that, they were so angered that they rounded up 425 leaders of the unions who caused the strike, and they killed them or exported them to Germany. That was a message for all of us in Holland. And the decrees became much more brutal after that strike. At first, all Jews had to wear the Jewish star. Anybody above age 6 had to have that star sewn on their left breast pocket. You couldn't clip it on, it had to be sewn on. And any non-Jew wearing a Jewish star in support of the Jews was subject to execution. Then the other decrees started coming. We weren't allowed to be in public schools. We could only go to schools that were special for Jews. We couldn't go to theaters, couldn't go to movie houses, couldn't go to public parks, couldn't play sports, couldn't be members of sororities or fraternities or any other social clubs. We were only allowed to shop in certain stores, and then only between the hours of 3 and 5 on Wednesdays. We were not allowed basically to have any mode of transportation. We weren't allowed to have bicycles, cars, motorcycles, anything of the sort. We weren't allowed to use public transportation. All Jews had to come to Amsterdam. So suddenly my parents' little apartment suddenly had in it both sets of grandparents, a great-grandmother, several cousins, an uncle, and so forth, all living in their small apartment. But still, we were alive, and we were able to survive, albeit not easily. In the meantime, my father, in the summer of '42, received a notice to report to a collection station where people would be shipped off to Germany for work camps. And at the outset, to everybody's knowledge, they were just work camps. Hitler hadn't yet started the exterminations, because I think the theory at the time was to get all able-bodied people to help support the war effort, and ultimately to take the Jews and get them out of Germany, which ultimately became a killing motive. My father went to the train station. He received the call up the same day as Margot Frank, for example. He went to the train station. He saw that people were being pushed into cattle cars, and he noticed, of course, that it wasn't just able-bodied young people, but it was invalids, older people, disabilities of various sorts, children, all being pushed into cattle cars. At that point, he decided that he would not go, and he went back to the hiding place and started preparing, ultimately, to go into hiding. In the meantime, the decrees kept coming. Every Jewish person lost their jobs. My father was workless for a long time. And they had to report all of their possessions of any value, up to and including gold teeth. And they all had to give up, ultimately, their worldly belongings of any significance. And in the summer of '42, when the deportations started, the writing was on the wall for my parents. My mother's sister, in the meantime, whose husband was active in the resistance and published an underground paper which ultimately became a national paper and is still published today, called it Parole. She was taken and put into a jail in Amsterdam, where my parents and my grandmother were able to at least get her on a list so she wouldn't be deported by using some of their diamonds to bribe the Germans. And ultimately, she was deported together with her 3 kids. Her husband stayed in hiding. And once that happened, my parents decided that they had to immediately go into hiding. I was born in 1939, shortly after my parents came back from their trip to the US. And at that point, when they went into hiding, which was on or about March 1st of 1943, I was at that point about 3.5 years old. They couldn't take me into hiding. Clearly, they couldn't take a young child who could be noisy, and I apparently was especially precocious. They decided they had to arrange with the resistance in Holland to place me with somebody who would take care of me while they went into hiding separately. Through the resistance, my parents were introduced to a policeman and his wife, ultimately, who took me in. I was first placed with their son, who lived in the suburbs of Amsterdam, and shortly after I was placed with that family, their marriage broke up, and probably because of me, and I went to an orphanage. And the father of this young man pulled me out of the orphanage and decided to take me in. That was the policeman, and he and his wife lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor in the western part of Amsterdam. They had no idea who I was. All they knew is that I was a Jewish child, and they also knew that if the Germans discovered that they were hiding a Jewish child, they would probably be executed on the spot or certainly deported. Nevertheless, they took me in. In the meantime, a policeman in Utrecht, who had become familiar with an uncle who had a factory in Utrecht, he arranged false IDs for everybody, and he arranged hiding places for many people in our family. My mother's mother was placed in a Catholic convent of some sort. My father's parents were placed, believe it or not, with a young Jewish woman, a young German woman, who pretended that my father's parents were her parents. This was a young woman who cavorted with German soldiers, and until the end of the war, no one suspected that they might not be, in fact, her parents. Others were hidden elsewhere. My mother was able to find a hiding place through her social work at the University of Amsterdam. She had mentored a family that the father was disabled, the mother worked, and they had 2 teenage daughters, and they lived above a store on the main street, one of the main shopping streets of Amsterdam. In their hiding place, they were placed in the attic, and at first they had to pay money for their hiding. My father had decided before they went into hiding that he needed money for them to go into hiding because he had to pay rent for their hiding place. He presumably had to pay for food and other sustenance items, and he felt he'd better get some money. So what he did is he went to a rug dealer that he knew because he was a rug buyer at the big department store. He went to a rug dealer in Amsterdam and said to him that he'd like to sell those rugs on consignment, meaning basically that nobody had to pay for them until he didn't have to pay the rug dealer until somebody bought the rugs. So he went to a lot of homes where the wealthier people lived, and many of them were Germans living in the houses of Dutchmen who had been deported. And he sold a lot of rugs in a matter of a few months and made quite a bit of money at that time. And then he went back to the rug dealer and he said, you know, at this point he had to go into hiding. He couldn't do it anymore. It was too dangerous. And the rug dealer said to him, he said, I know that you're an infidel. Other way around here. Do it this way. No, let me do it upside down. That's good. He said, I know you're an infidel, but here is my prayer rug. This is a Dagestan prayer rug. It's quite valuable. And it's a Muslim prayer rug. The dealer was a Muslim. And you'll see in the Muslim religion, you're not on a prayer rug allowed to show a face, but you see where it would go and you see where the hands are. And he said, take this prayer rug and take it with you into hiding, and even though you're an infidel, Allah will save you. Well, my parents took this into their hiding. Okay. My parents took the rug into hiding, and to get to the end of the story, my parents were saved, but they had a very, very difficult time. My parents were in an attic with no heat, no light, no electricity. And they spent their entire war years in that hiding place with almost no food. And they weren't allowed to make noise at night because, and this is unbelievable to me still, the people who lived immediately below them, so the people who hid my parents were on the floor above the toy store or shoe store on the bottom. Above them was another apartment with a young couple who worked during the day, and above them were my parents in the attic. At that point, they were afraid that the people in the middle could betray them. My parents were also very, very worried that the two teenage girls might betray them. And they basically stayed up there for that whole time without the people immediately below them ever knowing that my parents were hiding above them. They had no toilets. They had no running water. It was very, very difficult. My father never got out during the war, and as a result of edema, his feet became enormous. My mother got out on a couple of occasions. She would dare to go out at dusk, and because she was a woman, a young man would have been picked up immediately, but because she was a woman, she was able to avoid being captured. And she went out on one point because she had a toothache that was so terrible. It hurt so incredibly much that she couldn't live with it. So she went to a street where she knew there were several dentists, and she knocked on the door of one of the dentists, and she said, "I have no money, and I can't tell you who I am, but I have this terrible problem. Could you help me?" And the dentist took her in, and he drilled while his wife pumped a gadget like a sewing machine, because there was no electricity at that point, and he drilled her teeth, and he told her to come back in a couple of days. And again, she came back to have the stitches taken out, and he gave her not only a lack of pain, but also gave her a loaf of bread, which was worth anything in those days. The other times my mother got out was solely to go beg for food from people that she knew who were sometimes sorority sisters or others who might have some food. The reason the food became such a terrible problem was that in 1944, not that long before the war ended, the Queen of Holland demanded that the railroads stop shipping everything to Germany. The Germans took all the factories from Holland. They took any piece of metal, including church bells, from Holland and used them to support their factories. The Queen said at a given moment that that had to stop. The Queen was in exile in London. She had gone there with a British destroyer a couple of days after the war started. And as a result, there were no more shipments to Germany. And the Germans, again, as retribution, would no longer ship any food to Holland. In the meantime, there was a terrible winter. The canals were frozen. Nothing could get through. And so the Dutch experienced the hunger winter of 1944, when as many as 28,000 people died in Holland of starvation and cold. In the meantime, I lived a fairly comfortable life. I did not knowingly suffer. The policeman had a girlfriend in a German, in a bar in the red light district occupied often by Germans, where she was able to learn not only where she could get food, and she could get food, but also when there would be raids. And the raids were periodic. They were very brutal in Amsterdam because the Germans would block off a street on both ends and then go door to door looking for hidden Jews. In the meantime, ransom was paid by the Germans to Dutch people who would betray the Jews. And those ransom figures kept increasing, and a lot of Jews, in fact, were betrayed. I should make clear that before the war, there were 140,000 Jews in Holland in a population of about 9 million. After the war, there were only approximately 11 to 14,000 Jews left. The greatest percentage of any country, of any Western European country in any event, for the loss of Jews during World War II. These raids were effected by the Germans blocking off one end of the street, and if they came, or each end of a block, and if they came with dogs, my parents would have been doomed. But my parents were able to provide a hiding place. My father had been a carpenter's apprentice after he lost his job in the department store. And so he built a false wall underneath the staircase. and put in front of it jars of nails and whatever. And they hid behind that door during the couple of raids that there were, and luckily there were no dogs in the couple of raids that took place. At any rate, they survived and I survived, and on May 5th, 1945, Holland, and specifically Amsterdam, was freed by the Canadian Maple Leaf Brigade. And as a result of the liberation by the Canadians, the Dutch have always been extremely partial to the Canadians. Also, the Queen Juliana, who at that point was still a princess, spent the war years in Canada with her cousin, who was then the Prime Minister or the Governor of Canada. And there's always been a very close tie with the Canadian Maple Leaf Brigade. At any rate, on May 5th, 1945, Amsterdam was theoretically liberated, yet within 48 hours after that, some Germans took over a balcony at the men's club on the main square of Amsterdam called the Dam, and there they shot and killed a whole bunch of people as a last act of retribution while everybody was celebrating. I don't remember that much about the war because I was young, and the people I was with took no pictures. My parents came to get me on let's say May 7th, May 8th, probably by then. They came to pick me up at this apartment where I'd been. They had no idea where I was or whether I was alive during the entire time that they were in hiding. But the resistance kept track, and somebody from the resistance told my parents where I was, and they came to get me. And they knocked on the door, and the people who took me during the war knew immediately who it would be. And suddenly there appeared this couple, this terribly gaunt, skinny, emaciated couple, came and said that they were my parents. I didn't know who they were. It had been more than 2.5 years that I was in hiding, and these people suddenly appeared and said they were my parents. That was very difficult for the people who took care of me. It was very difficult for my parents. I guess it was difficult for me. They decided to wean me away slowly. First thing we did is they took me to the streets where everybody was celebrating. In Holland, the way you celebrate in Holland is basically to wear orange. Everybody was dressed with whatever they could find in orange, and anything orange was hanging out of the windows. Do you all know why orange is so significant? It's the Dutch royal house is the House of Orange. So whenever you see the Dutch flag, the orange pennant is above it, and if you see the Dutch team in the Olympics, it's always in orange, because that's the House of Orange. At any rate, I wanted an orange hat. And I made my poor parents, who could hardly walk, stand in line for hours till I got my little orange hat. We then went to their apartment where they had been in hiding. And while they were in hiding, and even though they had suffered this unbelievable hunger, they had saved for the day that their little son would come back a can of baked beans, which they had hidden under a floorboard. And with great ceremony, when we came, they opened this can of beans. And I said, "Ugh, I hate baked beans." And so they had saved all of this for nothing. At any rate, they ate it with great joy and licked the plate clean. And then we went back to my hiding place, where there was a celebration in the meantime with everybody on the block. It turned out that my war parents, who thought that nobody knew that they had a hidden child, it turns out everybody on the block knew. And nobody betrayed us. I think that's as much as I want to tell about our story. I would like to shift over quickly to the difference between our story and Anne Frank. Anne Frank, as all of you know, was in hiding in Holland and was betrayed and wound up being killed in a concentration camp or dying in a concentration camp. The difference between Anne Frank and us, which people don't realize, is Anne Frank was an immigrant. She was a refugee. Her father and family came from Austria, Germany. They moved into an area of Amsterdam where all the German refugees, Jewish refugees, had their own private area. We won't call it a ghetto, but it's where they lived. They never assimilated or integrated with the Dutch society. They spoke German. They looked down at the Dutch because of their advanced culture, and the Dutch looked down on them. It was never a situation where they had the support which my family had. We had the support of the resistance, which was largely a result of relationships of my mother and her sorority sisters. We had people providing money, providing food, providing communications. All of that was lacking for Anne Frank. And with 8 people in the back room of the Opetka factory, they were essentially doomed. By contrast, again, my parents were in hiding and nobody knew where they were. I was in hiding and nobody knew who I was. And yet we had the support of all these people providing real and fake ID cards, providing coupons for food, helping us in lots of ways. So I think it's important to recognize that there's a substantial difference between the Anne Frank story and mine, of course, has a nice ending. We came to the US in 1947. My father got his job back at the department store. He got some back pay. He got some money from the war reparations. And importantly, we obtained a very nice house and even had a little car. But we moved to the US, notwithstanding all of that, because my father was too afraid of the Russians. The Russians, in the meantime, had taken over all the countries of Eastern Europe. They were just 200 kilometers away from Holland. And my father just decided that he didn't want to risk, again, being subjected to living in an occupied country. So we came to the US and landed in the very town where I live now and where my brother and my family grew up. And the rest is history. I think I'd like to end it there and take any questions if we have time for questions.
So I'm going to begin with the first question, and then Sarah is our roving Mike. Isn't that fun? You have a new name, Sarah, roving Mike. Did you have a dog? And please tell us the story of your dog, because it's an amazing transition that you made between your war parents and your biological parents. And tell us about the role of that dog, and tell us about the dog.
Okay. I didn't know that this was significant until Gail told me it was significant. But At the end of the war, when I moved with my parents, my real parents, my war parents gave me their dog, whose name was Ruffy. And my war father and mother stayed in our lives very much while I was in Holland. I had an eye operation shortly after the war. My war father was there for me every day. He walked me to school on many, many days, and we stayed very close. He died in 1951, and his wife, widow, lived until 1983. I saw them very, very frequently and have stayed close with the relatives, the next generations of these people who saved me. And I even went to, I was there at the passing of my war mother. I was there at her deathbed, and shortly before she died, I asked her if there was anything she wanted, anything at all. And she said she wanted a pocketbook. So I jumped in my car, I drove at breakneck speed to the best shopping street in Amsterdam and to the best leather goods store, and I bought a Gucci Poochie bag of enormous cost and brought it back. But she never used it. At any rate, her son, her war brother, and I remained very, very close, and he died a few years ago, and he committed assisted suicide, which is permitted in Holland. And his widow, who is still alive and with whom I stay in touch, said it was one of the happiest days of their lives. They celebrated it with great joy, celebrated his life, and it was very, very meaningful for the whole family. I went to Amsterdam with a Stockton group this spring, which was also very meaningful and very nice. And the widow of my war brother spoke to the students in Amsterdam. She's 90 years old. She came on her bike and talked to the students, and then she rode back to her home on her bike. It's very Dutch. And I should mention, may I, Gail, about this September? Here comes Gail's next
question. I'm going to go to my
question.
friend Shani, who's as shy as I am not, to ask her to plant the question about righteous among the nations. So would you ask that question about the family?
Were the family that hid you and assisted your family, were they recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem?
Well, sadly enough, they were not for all these years. And a couple of years ago, I started trying to arrange for both sets of the couple who saved me and the couple who saved many of my relatives. And I did get that done. And on September 18th, on Monday, there will be a celebration at the Israeli embassy in The Hague where the families, the two sets of families will be honored, specifically the couple who saved us in each case, but they're no longer alive. But we do have the next generations, and they will be admitted to the righteous among the nations. I must say in passing, that this will be a fun trip in addition to this very meaningful thing, because on the day before the Yad Vashem ceremony, I am competing in the World Triathlon Age Group Championships in Rotterdam. So there's good reason to be there. So I'm a survivor in multiple senses. Any other thoughts or questions? I'll just mention what it was like to come to America. My mother took me first. We wound up in Port Washington. There was a small private school across the street from us, and my mother took me there. And then our neighbors told my mother that there were public schools just around the corner, and they were free. So my parents, who didn't know any of this, took me to the principal of the public school. And they said, here's my son, he doesn't speak a word of English. What's going to happen to him? And the principal said, well, this was a very severe, large woman. She said, well, for the first couple of weeks, the other kids will beat them up, but after that, it'll be fine. And I think that's what happened, at any rate. I'll take any other questions that anyone might like to offer. Going back to the people who rescued us, I'm going to mention one other thing. We did not honor the people who saved my parents in their hiding place. By contrast, there was a policeman in Utrecht who saved many, many people in our family, many uncles and aunts and cousins and so forth. The relationship with the people who hid my parents turned fairly ugly once the money ran out. And that was very, very difficult. And yet my parents stayed very close to the two teenage daughters. And the teenage daughters loved my parents and vice versa. And some of the artifacts that we hope to have here at Stockton will show that on the first anniversary of my parents going into hiding, the teenagers who hid my parents and became close to my parents wrote a 8-page, single-spaced, legal-sized poem to my parents on what it was like to have them come into their lives and how special that was. And that's probably the only large written work that I know of in the way of a poem by the people who were the rescuers, writing about what it was like to have these Jewish people suddenly come into their house. At any rate, yes, sir, there was a question. Sorry, Jeff.
Mr. Ullman, I saw in your book that you mentioned Manichow Hound, Operation Manichow Hound. Do you have any recollection of anyone's reaction to that?
I really don't. I think I hardly knew what was going on while I was in hiding. I was sheltered. Amsterdam was not bombed once the Germans took over. We heard planes flying overhead, and we had to draw our shades and so forth, but I never knew what was going on, to be honest. I was too young. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry.
Did your grandparents and your grandmom survive the Holocaust too?
That's a good question. My grandmother on my mother's, the short answer is yes. My grandmother on my mother's side was taken into a Catholic convent, and she sort of became Catholic. So at the end of the war, when we got her back, we had to reprogram her to her original religion, which wasn't easy. My father's parents, as I mentioned, spent much of the time with this German girl, pretending they were her parents. And right near the end of the war, a policeman came in and asked to see their papers, their ID cards, and I could show you what ID cards look like. And they all seemed to be real and authentic. And just as he was leaving, the policeman asked to see my grandfather's wedding ring. And he took the wedding ring and he took it off and he looked inside, and the initials did not match the ID card. So at that point, my father's parents were sent to jail, but they were never deported, and shortly thereafter the war ended. So they did all survive. And they basically, my father's parents stayed in Holland. My mother's mother came to the US, actually before we did. She was able to send some money to the US before the war started. And she lived in a beautiful apartment on 86th Street and Fifth Avenue in New York. And she bought us the house that we lived in. Thanks for the question. That's good.
Were you a friend of Anne Frank?
No, I never knew her, and again, she stayed pretty much in her German group, and I just didn't know her. I wasn't in a school with her or anything. But after the war, when I came to the US, I became the head of the Anne Frank Center in the US and spent a lot of time with her cousin, actually, who headed the Anne Frank Foundation in Switzerland. And I was very active with the Anne Frank story. You have to tell, can I tell the story? At a given moment, while I was the head of the Anne Frank Center in the US, I arranged to hire the former controller of the Anne Frank House in Holland. The head of the Anne Frank House and his assistant didn't like this guy, and he came to the US, and I agreed to employ him as the international director of the Anne Frank Center in the US. And at a given moment in the year 2000, he came to me and he said that he had 5 pages of the Anne Frank diary, and could I take care of them? These pages had never seen the light of day. And these were handwritten by Anne Frank, and they were especially harsh about her parents and about her own sexuality. So there I was with 5 pages of the Anne Frank diary that nobody had ever seen. I didn't have any idea what to do with this. Certainly in law school, they never told us what we should do if you get 5 pages of the Anne Frank diary. So I first called the Anne Frank House in Holland, and they said they wouldn't touch it. They said this guy stole it. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. They really thought that he had stolen these pages. Whereas the story was that Otto Frank, the father, had given them to him before he died and told him that these should never see the light of day because they were so harmful about her mother and about her own becoming a woman that he thought it would detract from the value of the diary. And so there I was with these pages. So I went to the Morgan Library just to get an indication of what they thought this might be, and it was obviously very valuable. And this fellow who arranged all of this agreed to give whatever proceeds, if we sold it, he would give it to our Anne Frank Center in the US. Shortly thereafter, we had arranged to start the process of auctioning these pages, and the Dutch government intervened and bought them all for $300,000, which wasn't all that much money, but it was significant. And it went to this man who gave me those pages, and he was supposed to give them to our Anne Frank Center. He never did. That's the end of my story with the pages of the Anne Frank diary.
What was it like to come through Ellis Island?
Believe it or not, we didn't go to Ellis Island because if you went to Ellis Island, you basically came on a boat in steerage, and we had a regular fare, and we went to Hoboken. But I do remember, of course, my mother, when we first saw the Statue of Liberty. I mean, the tears were just streaming down her face. But for me and my brother, you know, it was a joyride. We have no idea what was going to happen. But my brother, incidentally, was born, my wife figured out, exactly 9 months after the war ended. So we know how they celebrated the end of the war.
Okay. Did you have hope that you were going to survive? Like, did you have hope that you were going to survive?
I'm sorry, did I have what?
Did you have hope that you were going to survive the Holocaust while you're in hiding?
You know, I really didn't know enough to know what was going on, sadly enough. All I knew is that there were people who took care of me and fed me, and I was comfortable as far as I know. The Dutch people had to eat flower bulbs and sugar beets because those were readily available, and that was very demeaning to the Dutch people. I didn't know the difference. It tasted fine to me because I didn't know anything else.
Well, let's first applaud for our students. Didn't they ask great questions?
Yes.
And we have one, we'll let you be our concluding question, but let's now thank Leo. Wasn't that amazing?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Big deal. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll let you talk privately. I'm going to call, we're going to let the young man ask you the question privately, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. We're going to call up Doug Survey, who would like to introduce another one. Betty Gerbinchikoff, by the way, says goodbye, and she looks forward if you would like to invite her to your class. And Doug is going to introduce David Wisnia, our last Holocaust survivor, who would like to leave you with a gift. And this is truly a gift.
I'm Doug Survey. I taught at Oakcrest for 41 years. I'm now an adjunct here at Stockton. Went through the master's program. For the teachers in here that you're wavering whether you should do that, definitely do it. I wanted to go to class every Tuesday, Thursday night. Seriously. My students would also ask, what'd you do last night in class? Oh, it's been 15, 20 minutes. There is not a better program. And Dr. Kesselman did not tell me to say that, by the way. David Wisnia, I'll give you the short story. He'll come to your class. I'm the unpaid advisor and scheduler and driver, so if you want to get anything, you can contact with me. I'll be here again tomorrow. Was in Warsaw, was an orphan at 16, was captured, sent to Auschwitz, 2.5 years, survived that, death march to Dachau, escapes off a troop, prisoner of war, supply train, then joins the 101st Airborne, goes to Berchtesgaden, survives the war, and he's going to sing a song to you today, one of 2 that were written by him in Auschwitz. I mean, so he definitely does have an incredible story, as they all are. David?
the podium.
Okay,
and
yeah.
then-
Can you hold this? Do you want to hold this, or do you want to sing it? You want to hold this or sing into it?
What was that? You're going to be privileged to be the first audience who will hear, before it's published, the translation of a song I composed in Auschwitz, Birkenau, where I was a prisoner for over 2.5 years. I survived by singing, and when they found out that I could entertain and play the piano for the SS, I became a privileged prisoner. So let me give you first the translation of the Polish song, as you're going to hear it in Polish. I know very few of you understand Polish, but at least you'll get a taste of it. And then for the first time, you're going to hear the translation, because in Polish, you see, Polish does not have short words that rhyme. It's got to be long. Now, the problem is, it took my grandson, God bless, who is a graduate of NYU Music School and a specialist in bossa nova, but he translated it, and for the first time you're going to hear it before it's published in English. So let me give you the feel of the Polish part first, the translation of which is literally, according to Professor Servey, translation of Polish literally. When I remember famous Auschwitz, I felt like I was in a tomb. You see, in Polish it rhymes, in English it doesn't. Seeing the crematorium smoke, mud length and breadth, mud from neck to my feet, Appell, Abstand, Mitten ab, that's German. I hear it still. All day I want it. Oh, I writhe like a snake. The refrain is Oświęcim, which is Auschwitz in Polish. I'll smack you with all my might. Oświęcim, when I hear your name, it stings. Oświęcim, Oświęcim, how clear is the rhyme. For sleeping and eating, a curse on your house. You notice it doesn't rhyme. Oświęcim, for all the fighting in the buksas. That's the beds we used to sleep at. Oświęcim, you should have a shallow grave. Oświęcim, Oświęcim, heart be strong as steel. I despise you. I have some complaints about you. And the second stanza, this is a little town, I do not want to know it. Whatever there is blame, you get a smack in the mouth. Though you tremble like a leaf, even when sick, you still need to work. And for asking the question, where is this latrine, you get a smack in the mouth once or twice. That's the literal translation. You'll hear what my grandson did to it. He's a graduate of NYU Music School, and I hope all these years did something. First, the Polish. Gdy przypominam sobie sławny Oświęcim, czułem się jak w grobie. You see, it rhymes. Widząc krematorium dym, błoto wzdłuż i wszerz, błotem szyja, błotą nogi też. A zapytanie, gdzie jest tu latryna ta i ta, w mordę otrzymujesz raz lub dwa.
Oświęcim. Ja tłukłbym Ciebie, ile w lizie Oświęcim. Gdy Cię wspominam, to mnie gryzie Oświęcim, Oświęcim. Taki właśnie jest ten Rym. Za Twe spanie i jedzenie, szlak na Twoje pokolenie, Oświęcim. Za Twe dbanie Bóg zawszędzie, Oświęcim. Niechaj Ci ziemia lekką będzie, Oświęcim, Oświęcim. Serce masz jak stal. Gardzę Tobą, mam do Ciebie żal. That's the Polish version that became sort of popular after being a year in Birkenau, when I became a so-called privileged prisoner, no longer dragging bodies from the ditches. Translation for the first time, and before it's published. Professor Serby, here it is, the English translation, sort of, by my grandson, Avi Wisnia. And a plug for him, anyone who would like to see some fantastic pianist who accompanies me at my concerts now, and one who is quite adept in his own. On television, you could see him. His name is Avi Wisnia. Presents, and you could see all kinds of stuff there. So here we go. The translation according to Avi. I remember it so clearly, my days in Oświęcim. Got out alive just nearly, you see it rhymes, and still the name it stings. Still I see that place, enduring like the scars I can't erase. Appell, Abstand, mitten up, heard the sharp hearers call. You'll wish you were never born at all. Oświęcim. Through pain and sickness, always working, Oświęcim. With that behind you, always lurking, Oświęcim, Oświęcim. Evil like some twisted dream. Never mind the hope of fleeing. Hunger is the only feeling, Oświęcim. Like numbers on my arm, it lingers, Oświęcim. I curse you with my broken fingers, Oświęcim, Oświęcim. Heart be hard as stone. Hatred is the greenest weed you've grown. He did beautifully. Thank you.
That was a privilege. And this is a direct quote, so you could learn a little Polish. Whoa, I'm not going to wash my hair now for a long time. Thank you so much. There is a Hebrew expression, and it's lador vador, from generation to generation. And before we return to our friends at Yad Vashem, Leonard would like to say a few words. Leonard is second generation, and I want to recognize there are other second generation here whose parents were Holocaust survivors. We have Ellen. Is there anyone else? Ellen, if you would stand. And Ellen is also available to come to speak to your classes. So all the survivors that you met today are available to come to speak to your classes. The only thing we ask is that your students be prepared and just contact us directly. Anyone else here, second generation? Okay, Terry Kuhnrich, who's sitting next to Michael, right over there. Okay, Leonard, please.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you very, very much for coming to this, the first annual one of these two-day teaching courses. It really makes me feel very warm and good inside that so many of you have taken time out from your busy summers to attend this course. And I would like to thank all the staff, especially Gail at Stockton, for putting on such a good course. And I hope you have all learned a few things and taken some valuable lessons to take back to your classroom. And I just want to say a few little things here. It really does give me a tremendous amount of pleasure. It's a cause that's very deep to me. I don't want to see it ever happen again. A lot of people suffered. It was, it's human suffering at its worst. And the sad thing is, if you take the time to read the little article that my mother wrote some 50 years after Kristallnacht, you will see that a lot of the things that she mentions are still present in society today. This country itself has become rather intolerant of different peoples. People use the word divisive. We need to be aware of other people's backgrounds, where they come from, the differences that they have. But at the end of the day, we're all human, and we all need to be welcomed into society. And for you to go about your jobs at school and to teach the kids to be more understanding of people that are a little bit different to them, perhaps their religion's different, their nationality's different, or whatever it is, it's very important that we all go forward and live together in a unified place. And my hope is that you'll be much better equipped to take home the message, and that we can all together prevent another one of these tragedies from going on. But in reality, it's going on in other parts of the world, and the more we teach the kids, the more we will prevent it from happening again. And once again, thank you very much for coming.